Section 1. The silence before the discovery. There is a particular kind of silence that exists deep underground, in places where no living thing has walked for longer than human civilization has existed. It is not merely the absence of sound. It is something heavier than that. It is a silence that has weight, a silence that presses against you, that fills your lungs like cold water, that makes the small mechanical hum of a life support system feel almost unbearably loud by contrast. This is the silence of a Necron tomb world, and the silence has texture if you were sensitive enough to feel it. It carries the compressed weight of geological time, of epochs upon epochs, stacked one atop another, like layers in ancient rock, each layer representing millions of years of waiting, of maintenance, of the endless patient work of machines that do not tire. There is a quality to air that has been filtered and recycled and processed billions of times without ever being breathed by anything organic, a flatness to it, a completeness of absence, as though the air itself has forgotten what it was made for. The walls of these places do not echo in the way that stone walls in human structures echo. The sound goes in and does not come back, absorbed by the living metal, processed, dissipated into the substrate of the tomb complex as energy, rather than returned as sound. You could shout in one of these places, and the silence would consume your voice before it reached the far wall. Somewhere beneath the surface of a world that most of the Imperium of man would not even have a name for, just a catalog designation, a series of numbers on a stellar cartography chart, a world perhaps colonized for its mineral wealth or agricultural potential, its human inhabitants going about the small and precious business of their lives, entirely unaware the silence waits. The world above might be beautiful, probably is, in the way that most worlds bathed in sufficient stellar radiation are beautiful to beings evolved to respond to such things. Oceans of some color, plains of some texture, weather systems moving across the surface in patterns that any meteorologist could explain with equations developed over the past few thousand years. Birds or their equivalent, if the biosphere has evolved that far. Wind and rain and the turning of seasons. The ordinary miracle of a living world proceeding through its days and its years, with the cheerful indifference to meaning that living worlds have always had. None of this reaches the tomb. Not the light, not the warmth, not the sound. The surface is another planet entirely to whatever exists in the deep places. The surface is a rumor, a distant implication, a slight variation in the seismic readings that the Canoptech constructs note and file and do not consider further. The silence has been waiting for a very long time. 60 million years is a number that the human mind cannot truly hold. You can write it down, you can say it aloud, but the weight of it is beyond comprehension. 60 million years ago, the species that would become modern humanity had not yet separated from its primate ancestors. The continents of Earth itself looked different. The dinosaurs had only been extinct for 5 million years at that point, a fact that itself staggers the imagination. And yet, 60 million years ago, something was already ancient. Something had already lived entire civilizations, fought wars that reshaped the very fabric of reality, built technology that made the science of the 41st millennium look like children playing with sticks, and then, exhausted, diminished, and purposeful, chosen to lie down and sleep, and it has been sleeping ever since. Through the rise and fall of the Eldari Empire, which itself lasted millions of years, an empire that ruled the galaxy with such completeness that humanity, then barely a glimmer of potential on a world of blue and green, was essentially invisible to it. Through the fall of that empire, the catastrophic psychic detonation that created the Eye of Terror and birthed a chaos god in the same moment that it destroyed billions. Through the Age of Strife, in which humanity tore itself apart across the stars in psychic warfare that lasted for thousands of years. Through the coming of the Emperor, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and the 10,000 years of the Imperium of man that followed. All of this, all of it, the Necrons slept through all of it, and the galaxy above their dormant tombs was unrecognizable by the time they began to wake. Beneath this world's surface, the tomb endures. The architecture of a Necron tomb complex is something that the architects of the Imperium, for all their vast knowledge accumulated across thousands of years of civilization, cannot truly understand. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those obsessive priests of technology who hoard knowledge the way misers hoard coin, would spend lifetimes attempting to comprehend a single corridor of one of these places and never quite succeed. The materials involved are not materials that appear in any Imperial catalog. The construction methods leave no sign of the tools that created them. The scale defies rational engineering vast chambers carved from the bedrock of an entire planet. Their ceilings lost in shadow hundreds of meters above the floor. Their walls inlaid with geometric patterns of phosphorescent material that glows with a cold, viridian light that never flickers and never fades. The light comes from the living metal itself, necrodermis. The same substance from which the Necrons built their own bodies 60 million years ago. The same material that coats their warriors and flows through their veins in place of blood. In the deep places of the tomb, it breathes, if breathing is the right word, for the slow, almost imperceptible pulse of energy that moves through the walls like a heartbeat slowed down to geological speed. One pulse per day, perhaps, or perhaps once per week. The canoptech constructs that maintain these places do not think in human units of time. They think in functions and programs, in maintenance cycles and threat assessments, in the cold calculus of machines that have been left to do their work for 60 million years, without supervision and without rest. The canoptech spiders move through these tunnels on anti-grav fields that make no sound, their massive rounded bodies drifting between columns of black stone with the patient efficiency of beings that have never once felt impatience, have never once been distracted, have never once forgotten what they were built to do. Their compound eyes scan the corridors in wavelengths of energy that have no human name. Their fabricator claw arrays run their tests on the stasis crypts, checking power levels, checking seal integrity, checking the viability of the Necrons who sleep inside. A canoptech spider does not hurry. A canoptech spider does not delay. It works, and it has always worked, and it will continue to work until the machines that compose it finally fail, or until something with the authority to give it new orders tells it to stop. In the deepest chambers of the tomb, the Necron warriors themselves sleep. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands in larger complexes, sometimes hundreds of thousands in the grandest of the dynasty's crown worlds. They stand upright in stasis alcoves carved from the living stone, their skeletal necrodermis frames locked in a stillness deeper than death. Their eyes, those hollow sockets that will burn with viridian fire when they wake, are dark. Their weapons are folded against their bodies. They look, in the cold blue-green light, like monuments to themselves, like statues commissioned by a civilization that no longer exists to commemorate warriors who went to sleep an eternity ago and have not yet been told that it is time to rise. But they are not dead. They are not statues. Each one contains, if the word means anything at all in this context, a consciousness, a spark of something that was once a living, thinking, feeling Necrontyr being, stripped of most of its individuality by the process called biotransference, reduced to a fragment of programming and loyalty and deeply buried memory, but not gone, not entirely gone, still in there somewhere, in the dark, in the silence, in the sleep that is not sleep. And above them, in the Overlord's sanctum at the heart of the complex, the ruler of this tomb world sleeps too, but differently. The Overlord's stasis sarcophagus is not an alcove carved from stone. It is a massive construction of black metal and crystal, covered in inscriptions in the ancient Necrontyr script, surrounded by the instruments of command and warfare and governance. The Overlord inside it retains far more of what they were. The finest necrodermis bodies, with the densest engrammatic pathways, went to those of highest rank. The Overlord inside that sarcophagus is still, in some meaningful sense, a person. A person who was alive 60 million years ago, who remembers dimly, like a dream half-recalled what it felt like to be flesh and blood, who has ambitions and obsessions and a personality that survived the terrible stripping of biotransference because their position guaranteed them a body sophisticated enough to carry it through. The Overlord sleeps. The warriors sleep. The canoptech constructs move through the dark on their endless rounds. And in a chamber that should not exist in a corridor that does not appear on any of the tomb's master programs, behind a sealed door of adamantium and stone that was not placed there by Necron hands, something else waits. The canoptech spider that first detects it does not react in any way that could be called surprise. Surprise requires the capacity for expectation, and a canoptek spider does not expect things in the way a conscious being expects them. It simply registers an anomaly. An object in a section of the tomb complex that its records indicate should be empty. An object of significant mass, several tons. Its gravitic sensors calculate. An object composed of materials that are not necrodermis, not stone, not any of the materials cataloged in the canoptek's extensive internal libraries of known substances. An object that is, according to every scan, the canoptek's systems can perform. Inactive. Inert. Apparently dead, but not entirely dead, because buried within the object, within the massive, hulking, rust-dusted frame of ceramite and adamantium that fills this hidden chamber from floor to ceiling. This thing that looks like nothing so much as a mechanical giant, frozen in mid-stride, the canoptek's most sensitive life detection arrays register something extraordinary, something that should not be possible, given what this thing appears to be, something that is alive. A tiny biological signature, barely a flicker, deep within the machine's chest cavity. A heart rhythm, glacially slow, perhaps one beat per several minutes. Brain activity, minimal but unmistakable. The electrochemical crackle of organic neurons, firing at the absolute edge of existence. And something else, something that the canoptek's programs were not designed to detect and therefore struggles to categorize. Something warm. Something that, in whatever deeply buried way a canoptek spider can be said to find anything worth noting, the construct files in a special category that it creates on the spot for lack of any existing one. Unknown life form, encased in unknown mechanical chassis. Status, dormant. Potential threat, unclassified. Action, initiate reawakening protocols for command authority. The canoptek spider turns away from the hidden chamber and begins the long process of waking its masters. This is where our story truly begins. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and let us know where are you watching from and what time is it there. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, and your support is what makes that possible. Now, let us go deeper. Section 2. What the Necrons are, and what they remember. To understand what happens when the Necrons of this tomb world encounter what lies in that hidden chamber, you first need to understand what the Necrons are. Not just what they look like, skeletal, silver-green, armed with weapons that strip matter apart atom by atom, but what they actually are, deep in the substrate of their being. What they were before the machines, what was taken from them, and what remains. The Necrons began as the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were a humanoid species, biological as you or I, who lived on a world bathed in radiation from an unstable and cruel star. From the very beginning of their existence as a civilization, they were dying. The radiation that suffused their world shortened their lifespans, riddled their bodies with cancers, stole their children from them in the cradle. Where other species might have had 1,000 years of history before developing agriculture, the Necrontyr developed agriculture and metallurgy, and astronomy, and starship engineering, in the compressed time available to beings who knew from birth that they would not live long. There is a particular kind of genius that comes from desperation, from the knowledge that time is limited. The Necrontyr were that genius incarnate. They spread to other star systems. They built an empire. They developed technology that, even 60 million years later and filtered through the degradation of the Great Sleep, remains among the most sophisticated in the known galaxy. And they looked out at the universe and saw, with the special bitterness of the terminally ill, that they were not alone and that others were better off. The Old Ones were the galaxy's first true masters. Ancient beings, possibly reptilian in nature, possessed of psychic power and technological understanding, so profound that what they did was barely distinguishable from magic. The Old Ones had been navigating the stars since before the Necrontyr's sun was born. They had created the Webway, a network of dimensional corridors that bypassed the raw chaos of warp space and allowed instantaneous travel between any points in the galaxy where a gate had been established. They understood the fundamental forces of reality, not as equations but as instincts, as naturally as a human understands how to balance on 2 feet. And they were, compared to the radiation-poisoned Necrontyr, essentially immortal. The Necron asked them for the secret of their long lives. The Old Ones refused. We do not know precisely why. Perhaps they felt the Necron were not ready. Perhaps they had their own reasons, their own concerns about what an immortal civilization born of the Necron particular bitterness might become. Perhaps, to beings who measured their own lifespan in geological epochs, the request simply did not seem urgent. Whatever the reason, the refusal was received by the Necron as a contemptuous dismissal, and contempt from those who have everything to those who have nothing is among the most dangerous things in the universe. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necron Empire, looked at their people. Short-lived, cancer-riddled, brilliant, furious, and tearing themselves apart in civil wars, born of the knowledge that they would all die too young. They decided that what their civilization needed was an external enemy. An external enemy would give the warring dynasties something to unite against. And the Old Ones were right there, ancient and powerful and condescending in the way that only the very old and very comfortable can be condescending to the desperate. The First War in Heaven, as the Necrons would come to call it, did not go well for the Necron. This is an understatement. The Necron had superior numbers and fierce determination and the cunning desperation of the terminally ill, and they lost anyway, because the Old Ones had advantages that no number of warships or soldiers could simply overcome. The Webway made Old One logistics essentially perfect. Their mastery of psychic energy made their weapons unpredictable in ways that no tactical computer could anticipate. And their allies, races that the Old Ones had nurtured and elevated across millions of years of careful stewardship, were numerous and strange and powerful in their own ways. The Necron were pushed back to their home system, to their home world, to their irradiated sun and the dying bodies that sun produced. And in that retreat, something interesting happened to the Necron psyche. Other civilizations, broken back to their home world, might have despaired. The Necron did not despair. Despair, in a certain kind of psychology, requires hope. First, you have to have believed something before you can stop believing it. The Necron had never quite believed they were going to win in the simple sense. They had fought because they could not tolerate not fighting. Being pushed back did not end the fight. It clarified it. What you could call, without too much exaggeration, a civilizational pathology took hold. The Necron had always been shaped by their star, the radiation, the short lives, the cancers, the bitterness. These things had made them brilliant and driven and angry in ways that could be productive. Now, with the defeat of the First War burning alongside the radiation, those qualities curdled into something darker. The hatred that the Necron developed for the Old Ones, and through them for all forms of life that were longer lived and more fortunate, became one of the defining characteristics of the civilization. It did not produce useful creative energy the way ambition does. It produced something more focused and more dangerous, the will to see things destroyed, consequences be damned. The Triarch sat in its chambers and looked at the catastrophe they had created and searched for something, anything, that could change the equation. They found the Cetan. The Cetan, the star gods, as they would come to be called, were beings of electromagnetic energy that had existed since the birth of the universe itself, before planets formed, before stars ignited in anything like the way they shine now, feeding on the raw energy of stellar fusion in the deep cold between the stars. They had been there at the beginning of everything, vast and hungry, and largely uninterested in the concerns of biological life, because biological life, from the perspective of an entity that fed on stars, is almost unbearably small and brief. A Necron explorer, in some version of the story, found them. In other versions, the Cetan sought out the Necron. A particular Cetan, known as the Deceiver, and the name should tell you something about how this goes, made the Necron an offer. Immortality. The ability to transfer their consciousnesses from their failing organic bodies into bodies made of living metal, of necrodermis, the same substance from which the Catan themselves had been given physical form by Necron artificers millennia earlier. The Necron would be strong. They would be undying. They would be able to fight the Old Ones on equal terms and win. All of this was true. What the Deceiver did not tell them, what the Silent King, Sarek, the ruler of the entire Necron Empire, did not understand until it was too late, was the price. The biotransference process did not merely move consciousness from organic tissue to living metal. It consumed something in the transition. The C'tan, those vast and hungry star-feeding entities, gathered around the furnaces where the Necron were transformed and fed. They fed on the things that biotransference released: the soul stuff, the psychic essence, the intangible but utterly real component of a living being that gives it depth and feeling, and the full range of what it means to exist. What emerged from the biotransference furnaces was not quite the Necron tier. The Necrons, as they now called themselves, the new name for the new thing they had become, were stronger in every measurable physical sense. Their bodies were virtually indestructible. Their weapons were devastating. Their tactical intelligence was undiminished, but something was missing. For the warriors who made up the rank and file, the soldiers and common folk, the loss was nearly total. They emerged as automatons, following orders, functioning, fighting, but without the interiority that had made them Necron tier, without joy, without grief, without the ability to feel the sun, any sun, now that they were metal on their skin. For the nobles, for the overlords and lords and cryptechs, whose high station had guaranteed them the finest and most sophisticated bodies with the most complex engrammatic circuitry, the loss was lesser, but still profound. They retained their personalities. They retained their ambitions, their rivalries, their individual quirks and obsessions, but even they could not feel in the way they once had. Emotions arrived like echoes from a room they could no longer enter. The memory of what warmth felt like, but not the warmth. The memory of hunger, but not the hunger. This is what the Necrons carry into the 41st millennium. This wound. This 60-million-year-old scar, where their souls used to be. The Silent King, Sarek, understood immediately what had been done to his people. He saw it from the other side of his biotransference, felt the absence of what had been taken, and looked at the C'tan feeding on the spiritual detritus of his entire civilization, and knew that he had been deceived. He could do nothing immediately. The C'tan were too powerful, the old ones still unconquered, the situation requiring patience of a scale that most beings cannot conceive. But he filed the knowledge away. He waited. He planned. Eventually, the war in heaven was won. The old ones were broken, driven to extinction or exile by the combined force of the C'tan and their Necron servants. The galaxy was theirs, and it was empty of everything they had sought: the warmth of life, the pleasure of being alive, the simple animal satisfaction of existing in a body that could feel. Victory tasted like nothing, because they could no longer taste. And then Sarek struck, with weapons that the cryptechs, those brilliant and obsessive technologist engineers of the Necron race, had been secretly developing throughout the final stages of the war. Weapons designed to harm beings of pure stellar energy. The Necrons turned on their C'tan masters and broke them. Not killed them, the C'tan were too fundamental to physical reality to be truly killed, but shattered. Each of the great C'tan was broken into thousands of smaller fragments, called shards, that could be contained in tesseract labyrinths and used as weapons rather than endured as masters. The Necrons stood at the end of this process, at the top of a ruined galaxy. Their masters were imprisoned. Their enemies were extinct. And the galaxy itself was a wasteland. The war in heaven had been so catastrophically violent that it had destabilized the barrier between real space and the warp, unleashing waves of psychic predators called enslavers that were consuming whatever life remained. There was no point in being here. Not now. Not yet. So the Silent King gave his final order. He commanded every Necron, from every dynasty across every tomb world, to enter the Great Sleep, to lie down in their stasis crypts and wait, to sleep until the galaxy had healed, until the younger species had risen and filled the empty spaces, until the time was right for the Necrons to wake and reclaim what was theirs. And they obeyed, every one of them. Billions and billions and billions of Necrons, from the greatest overlord to the most lobotomized warrior, lying down in their sarcophagi in the prepared tomb worlds across 100,000 light-years of galaxy, sealing themselves in and closing their eyes and trusting that when the time came, they would be awakened. The time has come, but the waking has been imperfect. Not all tomb worlds survived the 60 million years. Some were destroyed by geological instability, their underground complexes crushed by tectonic forces that their architects could not have predicted across such vast spans of time. Others fell victim to the Aeldari, those space elves born of the Old One's final desperate experiments, who hunted and destroyed dormant Necron sites during their own age of galactic dominance. Others simply failed, cascade failures of stasis systems dragging hundreds or thousands of warriors into true death while they slept. And the waking itself is imperfect stasis that was meant to last specific intervals has in some cases run over. Systems have malfunctioned, and Necrons have awoken at the wrong time, in the wrong era, confused and damaged and barely functional. On this world, in this tomb, the awakening is only just beginning. The Canoptech spider's signal reaches the Overlord's sarcophagus. The revivification process begins. It is slow. It takes time for systems that have been in deep maintenance mode for millions of years to come back to operational levels, for the engrammatic patterns that constitute the Overlord's personality to fully reassemble themselves from the substrate of the necrodermis neural matrix. But time is something the Necrons have always had in abundance. The Overlord's eyes open. Viridian fire fills the empty sockets. Ancient intelligence, calculating and proud, and marked by 60 million years of uninterrupted absence, reassembles itself behind those eyes and takes stock of where it is, and what it has been told. There is something in the tomb that should not be there. The Overlord rises. Section 3. The architecture of the tome. You have to understand what these places are like before you can understand what it means to find something unexpected in them. A Necron tomb complex is not like anything else that exists in the galaxy. It is not a bunker, not a crypt, not a cave system, not a mine. It is all of these things, and none of them, something that was designed 60 million years ago with a purpose and a precision that makes the grandest cathedrals of the Imperium look like sandcastles. Enter through the surface access points if you could find them, which you almost certainly could not, because they are hidden with a thoroughness that borders on the obsessive, and you would descend. Down through shafts cut with absolute geometric precision from the bedrock of the planet, shafts that show no tool marks, because the instruments that made them did not leave tool marks, shafts that are as perfectly smooth as poured glass and as precisely circular as if a compass had been drawn against the sky. The descent goes deeper than you would expect, much deeper. The topmost chambers of a major tomb complex might be kilometers beneath the surface. The deepest are deeper still. The first chambers you would encounter are the Canoptech maintenance bays. These are where the constructs that keep the tomb alive rest, not sleep, because Canoptech constructs do not sleep, but cycle through maintenance states where they expose energy collector panels to absorb whatever ambient radiation seeps through from the surface, replenishing their internal reserves. In these bays, in the perpetual green glow of the necrodermis walls, you would see things that would look to you like enormous mechanical spiders and beetles and centipedes, because the Necrontier artificers who designed them were drawing on forms of life that had proven effective over geological timescales, and saw no reason to improve on what worked. The Canoptech spiders drift between their charging stations on their anti-grav fields, their compound eyes cycling through maintenance checks, with the focused mindlessness of machines that have been given one purpose and have spent 60 million years executing it. They are not curious. They are not bored. They do not wonder what day it is or how long they have been here. They simply work with a diligence that no biological creature could sustain, maintaining the systems that keep their masters sleeping and the systems that keep those systems functioning. Swarms of Canoptech scarabs patrol the corridors like rivers of living mercury. Each one is individually smaller than a human hand, a disc of necrodermis with legs and mandibles and sensors, simple enough in isolation, but capable of collective feats that stagger the imagination. A large enough swarm of scarabs, directed by a Canoptech spider, can strip a battle tank to its component molecules in minutes. They can rebuild damaged sections of tomb infrastructure from raw materials in days. They can detect an intruder's heartbeat through a meter of solid stone, coordinate instantly with every other member of the swarm and with the supervising spider, and respond with a precision that no individual creature could achieve. They move through the corridors in patterns that would look random to an observer, but are actually the expression of maintenance protocols so complex that the data required to describe them fully would fill libraries. Down from the maintenance bays, past security checkpoints, where nothing has triggered the defensive systems in 60 million years. Canoptech wraiths stand vigil in niches, cut into the walls, their bodies phase-shifted partly out of real space, invisible to most forms of detection, present but not wholly here, down further still into the heart of the complex. Something worth pausing on here is what it means for these security systems to have gone untriggered for 60 million years. Not because nothing has come near the tomb world, worlds drift, asteroids strike. The galaxy's geology does not stop merely because an ancient civilization decided to place its sleeping warriors below the surface. Over 60 million years, this world has been struck by meteors of various sizes, has experienced earthquakes and volcanic events, has had its surface worn down by wind and water, and then built up again by geological processes. The universe does not respect the privacy of the sleeping, and yet the tomb endures. This is one of the most quietly astonishing facts about Necron civilization, that the Adeptus Mechanicus, in its fragmentary and terrified studies of these places, has struggled to fully absorb. The engineering is so good, the materials so far beyond anything the current galaxy produces, the construction so precisely calibrated that 60 million years of existence has not meaningfully degraded it. Some parts have required maintenance. The Canoptech spiders were not idle over those millions of years, and the evidence of their work is everywhere, in the replaced sections of floor and wall and the repaired conduits in the power grid. But the fundamental structure, the core systems, the stasis crypts and the sarcophagi and the defense arrays, these are essentially as functional as the day they were sealed. This is what 60 million years of accumulated engineering knowledge looks like when it is applied without the constraints of limited time or limited resources. The Necron built these places to last. Not in the way that human architects talk about buildings lasting centuries, perhaps a millennium if everything goes very well, but truly lasting. Built to endure geological epochs. Built to survive the ordinary violence of a universe that does not care about the beings that move through it. Built to protect something precious through any duration of time that might be required. The stasis galleries are what every other part of the tomb exists to protect and maintain. These are long, wide corridors, wide enough for 20 humans to walk abreast, tall enough that the ceiling is lost in the upper darkness, lined on both sides, from floor to almost ceiling, with stasis alcoves. In each alcove stands a Necron warrior. The warriors of the lowest castes are almost entirely empty. Their necrodermis frames are intact, their Gauss weaponry fully charged, their physical form as fresh as the day they were sealed in. But behind those dark eye sockets, where the fire of active consciousness should burn, there is almost nothing. A tiny flicker of something, the ghost of the personality that was once there, too small to measure, too present to deny. 60 million years in stasis have not refreshed what biotransference took. They have simply preserved the loss, keeping the absence as pristine as the day it was created. Further in, the immortals stand in their own galleries. These are taller, more heavily armored warriors, whose stasis alcoves are more elaborate, their sealed environments maintained at tighter tolerances, the Canoptech spiders attending to them on shorter maintenance cycles. The immortals retain more than the warriors. Their bodies are built for greater independence of action, their programming more sophisticated, their reactions less purely automatic. They are not conscious in any meaningful way during the Great Sleep, but if you could somehow speak to the impression that remains in them, some thread of intention might respond. At the center of the complex, sealed behind layered security systems that even the Canoptech constructs cannot fully access without specific authorization, the royal court sleeps. This is where the overlords and lords and cryptechs lie in their individual sarcophagi, each one a masterwork of Necron tier craftsmanship from 60 million years before the setting of our story. The Overlord's sarcophagus is the grandest. It occupies the center of the sanctum, a massive black obelisk covered in script that records, in the ancient Necron tier language, the dynasty's history, its victories, its losses, its noble lineages, and their achievements. The script is in the language before biotransference simplified and standardized communication, a richer language, one that had words for things that the Necrons, who sleep inside these forms, can no longer experience. Words for the warmth of sunlight on skin, words for the taste of food and drink, words for the complex emotional textures of grief and love, and the specific satisfaction of physical touch. The Necron who carved those inscriptions had all of those things. The Necrons, who now lie within the sarcophagi, those inscriptions describe no longer do. The maintenance corridors that connect all of these chambers are maintained with the same absolute diligence, floors worn smooth over millions of years of canoptech movement. Walls repaired so many times that the original stone has been replaced section by section, the repairs seamless, indistinguishable. The whole structure kept in better condition than the day it was sealed. Power flows through conduits of necrodermis, drawn from geological energy sources tapped deep in the planet's core. The lights, those viridian pulses never vary. The temperature never shifts. The air is processed and filtered and maintained at precise atmospheric specifications, because some of the biological components sealed within these machines might need air, even sleeping, and the canoptech constructs were programmed to consider every contingency. For 60 million years, this has been sufficient. For 60 million years, the tomb has been as it was designed to be sealed, maintained, secure, waiting. Then, something changed. Not recently, in the grand context of the tomb's history, but recently in the sense that it happened after the Great Sleep began, at some point during the long absence when the canoptech constructs had sole dominion over these places. Something came in. The section of corridor where the anomaly now sits was not always inaccessible. The records, as much as the canoptech spider can reconstruct from fragmented maintenance logs that go back only as far as the last major system reset itself, a staggering 3 million years, suggest that this section was once a transit route between two maintenance bays that were themselves decommissioned when they became redundant after the Great Sleep began and the warrior maintenance requirements dropped to near zero. The doorways were sealed, not for security reasons, but as an energy conservation measure. The sealed sections were simply removed from the canoptech patrol routes because there was nothing in them that required maintenance. Except now there is. The hidden chamber is about a third of the way along the sealed corridor section. The sealed door that leads to it is not Necron construction. The spider's sensors make that much clear immediately. The material is ceramite and ferrosteel alloy, neither of which appear in any Necron catalog. The construction is crude by Necron standards, involving physical bolts and pressure seals of a type that suggests the builders were working under severe constraints, perhaps without proper tools, perhaps in a hurry. The door has been there for a long time, the spider estimates. Hundreds of years, perhaps 1,000 or more, which by the standards of the tomb's history is a recent addition. Someone found their way in here once, someone who did not belong, and they left something behind. The canoptech spider has already filed its report. The revivification sequence for the royal court has already begun. In the Overlord's sanctum, far above and deep in the complex's heart, the ancient conqueror who sleeps in that great black sarcophagus is beginning the long process of returning to something like consciousness. The tomb is waking up. Section 4, the Discovery Chamber. The first Necron to actually enter the hidden chamber is not the Overlord. It is a royal warden, one of the intermediate warriors, sophisticated enough to make independent observations and report them accurately. Not quite a noble, but not quite a common warrior either. In Necron military hierarchy, royal wardens serve as the practical enforcers of noble will, the beings who go ahead, assess, report, and act with a limited degree of independent judgment that the mindless warriors below them cannot exercise. Royal wardens are, in the Necron hierarchy, something of a study in the gradations of biotransference's effects. The common warriors at the bottom of the hierarchy are barely conscious in any meaningful sense. They move, they obey, they fight with considerable capability, but behind the viridian eye glow, there is almost nothing that could be called a personality or an interior life. The great overlords at the top retained enough of their original Necron personalities to be, in meaningful senses, individual recognizable people with specific obsessions and ambitions, and the accumulated weight of 60 million years of experience. The royal wardens sit between these extremes. They have more independence than the warriors, more personality, the ability to make judgments that require genuine cognition rather than just programmed response. But they have less of themselves than the nobles, less depth, less of the richness that the finest necrodermis bodies could carry through the biotransference. In the 41st millennium, after the Great Sleep has eroded even those carefully preserved personalities, the The royal wardens sometimes have a quality that the Necron nobles find vaguely uncomfortable when they think about it, which they mostly prefer not to. They are a visible reminder of what everyone further down the hierarchy has lost, and a visible reminder that what the nobles have preserved is itself only a fraction of what should be there. This royal warden has been awake for perhaps 2 standard hours by the time the sealed door is breached. 2 hours of reorientation checking systems, confirming operational status, receiving the Canoptech Spider's report, processing the fact that something significant has occurred in a section of the tomb complex that should not contain anything significant. 2 hours during which the awareness that had been scattered across 60 million years of empty, dreamless stasis has reassembled itself into something approaching the being who went into that sleep, though imperfectly. The royal warden who emerges from the stasis alcove is like a drawing made from memory of a photograph that no longer exists. It approaches the sealed door with the measured calm of something that has no fear response in any biological sense, accompanied by 4 Necron warriors whose presence is almost purely precautionary. The warriors are barely more than armed automatons, but they are armed automatons with Gauss flayers, capable of stripping any known matter to its component particles, and their presence beside a more capable commander is the Necron equivalent of reasonable preparation. The ceramite door is not strong enough to resist what the warden can do to it. Necron technology can manipulate matter at a fundamental level. Phase shifting, disassembly at the atomic scale, or simply the brute application of forces that Necrontier science mastered 60 million years before the people who built this door learned to smelt metal. The warden considers the options and selects the simplest, a sustained energy discharge from its staff of light that heats the door's locking mechanisms to the point where the metal flows and the seal fails. The door opens inward. The chamber beyond it is revealed. It takes even the royal warden a moment to process what it is seeing, and a Necron royal warden processing something for more than an instant is itself notable. What fills the chamber is not small. It occupies most of the available floor space, its bulk reaching most of the way to the ceiling. At first, the warden's sensors categorize it as debris, inert, structural, perhaps some piece of equipment left here by whoever built that door. A collapsed mining machine, maybe? Or a piece of construction equipment too large to remove and therefore abandoned. But then the sensors go deeper. The object is bipedal. Or was, when it was functional. It is standing now, but barely, leaning against the far wall with one massive arm braced against the stone, its head tilted slightly forward, its torso showing the cracks and deformations of what appears to be significant combat damage that has never been repaired. It is enormous, 3 meters tall at minimum, perhaps slightly more, with a footprint that would require most of the living space of an Imperial habitation unit just to stand in. Its construction is layered ceramite and some adamantium alloy. Both of these the warden can now identify from its operational knowledge base, metals that appear in various forms throughout the galaxy. Whoever built this machine built it for war. That much is immediately apparent. The limbs are weapon systems. One arm terminates not in a hand, but in a rotary cannon arrangement, currently inactive, its multiple barrels caked in dust that has settled over however many years it has been standing here. The other arm ends in a massive mechanical fist, each knuckle the size of a grown human's torso, the whole thing wreathed in dormant energy coils that the warden recognizes as designed to supercharge the physical impact of a blow. The shoulder mounts hold targeting systems. The torso is armored beyond anything a biological creature needs armor to be. Layers of ceramite thick enough to stop most projectiles that anything the Imperium currently fields could produce. At the center of the torso is a sealed compartment. The warden's sensors focus there, and what they return stops the warden's processing for a full 2 seconds, which in Necron terms is an eternity. Something is alive inside it. The biological signature is faint but unmistakable. The Canoptech Spider's initial report was accurate. There is a living organism within this machine, sealed into the machine's chest cavity, sustained by life support systems that are still, somehow, barely functioning after what appears to be centuries of dormancy. The organism is humanoid, Large for its kind, even by the standards of the species and the Warden's records, reconstructing themselves from the deep archives of the Necron tier data libraries that survived the Great Sleep, are beginning to suggest a match for the species. Homo sapiens. The species that the Necrons have been encountering in increasing numbers as the Great Sleep ends and contact with the galaxy's current inhabitants resumes. Astartes variant, a subspecies of human, heavily modified, significantly larger and more physiologically robust than the standard model. A space marine, entombed in a machine that is itself a kind of tomb. The Royal Warden studies this discovery for a moment more. Its processing reaches a conclusion. Then it activates the communication node in its neural matrix and broadcasts a compressed data package back to the Royal Sanctum, where the Overlord is, by now, sufficiently conscious to receive it. The package contains everything the Warden's sensors have gathered: the object's dimensions, its material composition, its weapon systems, and estimated capabilities, the life sign inside it, the age estimate for the door that sealed this chamber, several centuries at minimum. The condition of the object's life support systems degraded, approaching failure, but still marginally functional. The assessment of the object's own operational status inactive, but potentially repairable. And then, because the Royal Warden is sophisticated enough to understand that context matters, the Warden adds something to the report that the Canoptech Spider would not have included. An observation, a note. The thing inside this machine is very old. Older than the machine itself suggests, older than the material age of the chamber suggests. The biological substrate, what little the sensors can read through the life support systems, and the sealed ceramite hull, shows cellular markers consistent with extreme age. Not centuries of age, as the chamber door might suggest. Something older, much older. This occupant has been sleeping, in this machine, for a very long time indeed. The Overlord receives the data package, processes it, and then, for the first time in 60 million years, experiences something that it can recognize as genuine curiosity. It rises from its throne. It summons its court. It issues the order that brings the entire available strength of the awakening tomb world to a state of readiness. And then it walks, with the measured and absolute authority of a being that has commanded armies since before the species of the creature in that chamber existed, toward the hidden chamber, to see for itself. The walk takes time, because the tomb complex is large, because the Overlord moves at the unhurried pace of something that has learned over the span of geological ages that rushing rarely improves outcomes. Along the way, the cryptech of the court falls into step beside the Overlord, asking in the silent language of direct neural transmission the questions that cryptechs always ask, questions about the composition of the object's materials, about the life sign readings, about whether the thing inside is truly alive, and if so, what it might be able to tell them. The Overlord does not answer these questions yet. The Overlord has its own questions, and they are older and more careful and more patient than the cryptech's scientific hunger. They arrive at the hidden chamber. The Overlord stands in the doorway and looks at what waits inside, and for a moment, just a moment, something moves behind those ancient Viridian eyes that is harder to name than tactical assessment, harder to categorize than threat analysis. Something that reaches back 60 million years through the necrodermis neural matrix and finds, in the very deepest and oldest archive of the engram-kept patterns that constitute this ancient being's personality, a dim and distant memory. This thing knows what it is to be sealed inside a body that is not truly alive. This thing knows what it is to sleep without dreaming. This thing knows what it is to be preserved in a form not chosen, to carry consciousness through impossible durations, in a vessel designed for war rather than living. The recognition is not compassion. The Necrons are not capable of compassion in any simple sense, but it is recognition. The Overlord enters the chamber. Section 5. The Overlord's calculation. The Necron Overlord's mind processes simultaneously. All available data arrives at once. All possible interpretations are generated in parallel. All probable outcomes are mapped and weighted before any response is formulated. The personality and the Overlord does have a personality, has one that survived biotransference and survived 60 million years of stasis with remarkable fidelity, does not precede the analysis. It shapes the framing of the analysis and the weighting of the outcomes, but it does not short-circuit the process. This is not, the Overlord would probably note if asked, an entirely pleasant way to experience existence. The simultaneous processing means that no moment of recognition or realization arrives clean. Every insight comes pre-packaged with its complications, its counterexamples, its implications for future action. There is no simple joy of discovery, no clean surprise, no moment of pure feeling before thinking arrives to qualify it. The Overlord has never experienced any of this, even before biotransference removed the last of the simpler feelings. The Necrontier nobility were always analytical first, their station demanding the suppression of impulse in favor of calculation. Biotransference completed what a lifetime of court training had begun, and yet, somewhere in the deep engrammatic archives of the Overlord's neural matrix, in the layers of pattern that constitute what remains of a personality built on 60 million years of compressed experience, there is something that responds to this situation in a way that the simultaneous processing cannot entirely flatten. The Overlord stands at the door of the chamber and looks at the thing inside it, and the data arrives all at once, as always. But there is one piece of the data that the analytical machinery keeps returning to, that it processes and reprocesses in a way that suggests it has not been fully resolved. The thing inside the machine is a warrior who chose to be sealed into a tomb for reasons that made sense to them at the time, and has been waiting in that tomb for longer than they expected to be waiting. The Overlord chose to be sealed into a tomb for reasons that made sense at the time, and waited in it for 60 million years. This is where we find the Overlord's calculation, then. Not at the tactical level, not at the intelligence gathering level, but somewhere deeper, in a place that the Overlord's processing machinery circles around without quite landing on, the way even the most powerful analytical engine sometimes orbits a truth without quite touching it. Here is what the Overlord calculates. The object in the chamber is a war machine of the species currently known to Necron strategic files as Astartes, the enhanced warrior caste of the Imperium of Man, the dominant political entity currently holding significant territory in the galaxy. The Overlord's records on this species are incomplete, reconstructed from fragmentary intelligence gathered in the short time since this tomb world began its awakening process. But what is there is sufficient. The Imperium of Man is a civilization that the Necrons find, frankly, crude. Their technology is in many respects regressive. They reverse engineer and maintain equipment they no longer fully understand, relying on ritual and superstition to fill the gaps in their technical knowledge. Their political structure is a theocratic bureaucracy, so vast and so inefficient that it requires tens of millions of administrators just to stay marginally functional. Their military doctrine is effective, but wasteful, in ways that would have appalled Necrontier military strategists. They are, by every measure available to Necron analysis, a young civilization not in absolute years, but in the sense that matters, which is the depth of their understanding of the universe they inhabit. And yet, the Overlord cannot dismiss them entirely, and the Overlord is honest enough in that ancient and calculating way to acknowledge why. The species is tenacious. The Overlord has access, in its deep archives, to brief engagement records from other awakening tomb worlds, intelligence shared through the transdimensional communication networks that connect Necron dynasties across the galaxy. The engagement records show a species that adapts to adversity with a speed that is, by any reasonable measure, remarkable. They fight with a fervor that compensates for a great deal of technological deficit. And their Astartes in particular, these warriors who are not quite fully human, who have been engineered and modified and changed until they can survive things that would kill standard humans many times over, fight with a single-mindedness that the Overlord recognizes, in a distant way, as philosophically similar to something in Necron military culture. These warriors do not give ground easily. They do not surrender. They fight until they are destroyed. The machine in the chamber is one of their most extreme examples of this principle. This is a weapon system built specifically to preserve a warrior who would otherwise die, who cannot be allowed to die, whose tactical knowledge or strength of will or sheer fighting capacity is considered too valuable to lose. The warrior's broken body is sealed inside the machine, sustained by it, connected to it, made part of it. The machine fights. The warrior directs it. They are, together, something greater than either, could be separately. The Overlord recognizes the concept. Not from any specific memory of encountering such a thing before, the Overlord has no memory of ever having seen one of these machines, but from something deeper, something in the philosophical substrate of what the Overlord itself is. A consciousness preserved in a body not of its own choosing. A mind connected to a machine that fights and kills on its behalf. An existence that exists at the boundary between life and something else. The Overlord is not the machine's biological occupant, of course. The parallel is not precise, but it is present, and the Overlord does not discard it. The analysis continues. Why is this machine here? That question matters more than any other, initially. The tomb is a sealed environment. It was sealed 60 million years ago and has remained sealed since. For something from the current era to be inside it, either the tomb was breached and then resealed, which the Overlord finds unlikely, given how intact the outer perimeter's defense systems appear, or something more interesting happened. Someone found a pre-existing crack in the seal, a compromised section of wall, a passage that the ancient Canoptech programs had written off as decommissioned and therefore not worth defending. A way in that was not a way in, according to the tomb's master program, but that could be used by someone patient and observant enough to find it. Someone found their way into this tomb, and they brought this machine with them, or they found it already here. Or, and this is the possibility that the Overlord holds in a special part of its analytical matrix, flagged and weighted higher than the others. They were brought here already, sealed inside it, already dormant, somehow arriving in this place from some context that the Overlord cannot yet reconstruct. What the Overlord can determine, the ceramite door was installed from the inside. The tool's marks on the mounting hardware, minimal as they are, point inward. Someone sealed themselves into this chamber deliberately. Someone who had access to construction materials and a reason to want isolation. The life support systems on the machine are failing. Slowly, incrementally, by tiny fractions, but the trajectory, extended back in time by the Overlord's predictive models, suggests they have been failing for approximately 200 years. Before that, they were functioning at a reduced but stable level. Before that, further back, the Overlord's models run out of data, but the machine itself appears designed for very long dormancy periods. Its life support systems more robust than anything merely incidental would need to be. This machine was designed to wait. It was designed to sustain its occupant indefinitely, in a state between battle readiness and hibernation. And the occupant has been waiting. One more thing catches the Overlord's attention. One more item from the sensor data that the Royal Warden's report included. On the surface of the machine, in several places, there are markings. Inscriptions. Not decorative, the Overlord's pattern recognition systems identify them as linguistic, as writing. The script is unfamiliar. The language, the Overlord's records suggest, is a dialect of the Gothic language used by the Imperium of Man, itself a degraded descendant of even older linguistic forms. The Overlord does not read it fluently, but it reads it. The inscriptions are names, battle honors, the tallies of a warrior who fought for a very long time and wanted to remember what they had done. The Overlord reaches the conclusion that the analysis has been building toward and issues its first directive. The machine is not to be destroyed. The machine is not to be moved. The machine is to be scanned in full, its contents analyzed, its operational systems assessed, and the cryptech is to determine whether the life support systems can be stabilized and whether whatever degree of dormancy the occupant is currently in can be maintained, or more interestingly, whether it can be safely reversed. The Overlord does not frame the question in terms of curiosity. It frames it in terms of intelligence gathering. A being who has been in this tomb for perhaps centuries, who chose to seal themselves here, who has perhaps witnessed more of the tomb's history than the Overlord has been awake to observe, such a being might have useful information. That is the reason the Overlord gives. Whether it is the only reason is left as an exercise for the observer. Section 6. What a Dreadnought is through Necron eyes. The cryptech takes over the examination with the quiet intensity of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity since long before the Great Sleep, which, given that the cryptech went into that sleep 60 million years ago, is a statement of considerable commitment. Necron cryptechs are the scientist engineers of the race. Where overlords are conquerors and administrators, cryptechs are researchers and specialists, the beings who understand the technology that makes Necron civilization function and who are always interested in extending that understanding. A cryptech's relationship to their specialty can tip into obsession in ways that even other Necrons find unsettling. The galaxy is full of cryptechs who have spent millions of years, the majority of their existence, pursuing a single question, a single discovery, a single refinement. The most famous among them, a being called Illuminor Ceres, has spent his entire post-biotransference existence trying to understand biological life well enough to reverse the process that took it from his people, and in doing so has dissected more living creatures than any count could cover. This cryptech is not Ceres, but the same fire is there, dimmed by the emotional dampening of biotransference and the long emptiness of the Great Sleep, but not extinguished. The cryptech approaches the machine with scanning arrays already active, already feeding data into the dense analytical matrices of a mind that was, 60 million years ago, one of the finest technical intellects among the Necron-tier aristocracy. The first thing the cryptech establishes is the machine's age. This is harder than it sounds. The ceramite that makes up the bulk of the chassis has a material composition that the cryptech's records can partly account for. It is a refined mineral alloy that appears in various forms in Imperial construction, but the bulk of the chassis, specific refinement process, the specific ratios and additives are not in the cryptech's catalog. The records it has on Imperial technology are fragmentary, gathered from brief contacts and intelligence assessments. But there are some methods of age determination that work regardless of the specific material involved. Radiation absorption patterns, crystal growth patterns within the alloy, the degradation of the polymer-based lubricant compounds in the machine's hydraulic systems. These tell a story. The machine is old, very old. The cryptech's calculations converge on an estimate that is startling even by the standards of an entity that measures its own history in millions of years. The machine was manufactured, the data suggests, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 standard years ago. This is within the range of what the Imperial historical records limited, as the cryptech's access to those records is, call the Horus Heresy era, or the immediate post-heresy period. A turbulent and catastrophic time in Imperial history. A conflict in which a significant fraction of the Imperium's military turned on the rest, and in which tens of billions of lives were lost across a war that lasted for decades. That the machine survived 4,000 years and is still barely functional is a statement about its construction quality. Nothing the Imperium currently builds would last 4,000 years without extensive maintenance. This machine has had none, yet it stands. More remarkable still is the occupant. The biological entity inside the chest sarcophagus of the machine is, as the Royal Warden initially estimated, an Astartes, a space marine in the common Imperial parlance. The life sign readings that the cryptech's more sophisticated scanning equipment can obtain paint a more detailed picture than the Warden's initial survey managed. The organism is humanoid, male, massively enhanced compared to baseline human physiology. Doubled organs in several body systems, a secondary skeleton reinforcing the primary, musculature that would allow it to lift weights that would seem structurally impossible for the size of the organism. These modifications are not technological, they are biological. They are this organism's actual body, engineered or gene-altered into being over what would have been a years-long process, beginning in childhood. The organism is alive, just barely. Its heart rate, it has 2 hearts, the cryptech notes. Adding another data point to the file is extremely slow, 1 beat every 4 to 6 minutes across both organs. Its core body temperature is depressed, significantly below normal human baseline. Its neural activity is minimal but present, the electrochemical firing of neurons in a pattern that the cryptech's models identify as consistent with extended dormancy rather than any form of active consciousness. The organism is not dreaming, it is barely existing, but it is existing. The life support systems that maintain this existence are, by the cryptech's technical assessment, astonishing in a context-specific way. They are not sophisticated by Necron-tier standards. By the standards of Imperial technology, they may well be among the most advanced life-sustaining devices their civilization produces, but compared to what the Necron were building 60 million years ago, they are simple. Nutrient delivery through a minimal intravenous system, waste processing through a basic cycling loop, atmospheric management within the sealed sarcophagus, keeping the gas composition within survivable parameters, temperature regulation, cardiac stimulation at the lowest possible level, consistent with keeping the organism alive, simple, but remarkably durable. Remarkably well designed, for exactly the use case, they have been subjected to centuries of uninterrupted, unattended operation. Someone designed these systems knowing that they would need to run for a very long time without anyone to look after them. The cryptech moves on to the machine itself, the chassis, the weapon systems, the neural interface that connects the biological occupant to the mechanical exterior. This is where the analysis becomes genuinely interesting, the interface, the connection between the biological entity and the machine. The cryptech has seen versions of this concept before in Necron technology itself, in the way that Necron neural matrices connect biological memories to necrodermis substrate, in the way that certain canoptech constructs accept and process directive signals from their overlords. The principle is similar. The implementation is radically different. In Necron biotransference, the connection between biological pattern and mechanical body is total. The biological original is consumed, its patterns transferred into the metal, the original destroyed. What remains is purely mechanical, carrying the impression of the biology it replaced. The cryptech finds this system, by contrast, to be something philosophically distinct. The biological occupant is still biological, the machine is still mechanical. The connection between them is a bridge rather than a replacement. The organism's nervous system interfaces with the machine's systems through a series of connection points where biological tissue and technical components physically intermesh. The organism's thoughts become the machine's movements. The machine's sensors become the organism's perceptions. They are not one thing, as the Necron entity is one thing. They are two things, connected, functioning together as though they were one thing. The cryptech considers this for a long time. The concept being expressed here is one that the Necron themselves wrestled with in the centuries before biotransference was decided upon. There were factions among the Necron who argued for partial transfer, keep the organic body, augment it with mechanical components, bridge the gap rather than cross it entirely. They were called, in the ancient Necron political vocabulary, the conciliators, those who sought to reconcile the organic and the mechanical rather than elevating one at the expense of the other. Their argument was that any solution that destroyed the organic origin in order to preserve the organic pattern was solving the problem by eliminating the thing the problem was about. The Satan's proposal was total replacement, and the Triarch approved it because the military situation demanded something decisive and total, and the conciliator position, for all its philosophical coherence, did not offer the same promise of absolute power that total replacement did. And so the conciliators were overruled and eventually became moot, their argument preserved only in the deepest historical archives where the pre-biotransference political debates were recorded. But here, before the cryptech, is a civilization that took the other path, that faced the same fundamental problem. A warrior too valuable to lose to the limitations of a biological body, and solved it differently. Not by replacing the biology with metal, but by surrounding the biology with metal. Not by consuming what was there and preserving its pattern, but by protecting what was there and extending its capabilities. The conciliator position, applied in practice, 4,000 years after the argument was settled for the Necron by a choice that cannot be undone. The cryptech cannot call this superior technology. By most measures, it is not. The machine is weaker than an equivalent Necron system would be. The biological component is fragile in ways that no necrodermis frame is fragile. The interface is crude compared to the seamless integration of Necron neural matrices. But something is different about it. Something that the cryptech's cold analytical mind has to work quite hard to articulate. The thing in the chest of this machine is still what it was before the machine. Still, fundamentally, that organism, modified, extended, preserved, but not replaced. The Necrons were replaced. The Cryptek turns this over and over in its analytical matrices, and eventually does what Crypteks do when they encounter a question too fundamental for immediate resolution. It files it. It sets it aside for later processing. It returns to the more tractable question of what to do about the machine's failing life support systems. There is something the Cryptek can do. Necron technology is capable of providing supplemental life support that would be so far beyond the capability of the machine's existing systems that the comparison is almost offensive. The question is whether doing so is sanctioned, whether the Overlord's directive extends to active intervention, whether this organism is to be treated as something to be kept alive or merely observed. The Cryptek transmits the question. The Overlord's response is immediate and unambiguous. Keep it alive. Section 7. The Cryptek's fascination. The Cryptek works. This is a statement that, in the context of a Necron Cryptek, carries more weight than it might appear to. A Necron Cryptek working is a thing of absolute focus, a concentrated application of 60 million years' worth of accumulated knowledge and obsession, wielded with the precision of an entity that does not get tired, does not get distracted, does not require food or water or sleep, and has trained every analytical capacity it possesses on a single problem for as long as it has existed. The supplemental life support system the Cryptek constructs around the dormant machine is, externally, almost invisible, a network of canoptek scarabs arranged in specific configurations against the machine's chassis, creating microconduits through which Necron-grade energy can supplement the machine's own failing power cells. The scarabs themselves know nothing of what they are doing in any conscious sense. They are directed by the Cryptek's neural matrix, their simple decision-making systems, slaved to its commands, their bodies positioned and repositioned with a precision that would be invisible to any observer without extremely sensitive instruments. The effect is that the machine's power readings stabilize. The slow decay curve that had been taking the life support systems towards zero reverses. The biological signature inside the chest sarcophagus remains faint, but it is no longer diminishing. Deeper, the Cryptek's modifications are more invasive, but still carefully non-destructive. A Necron Cryptek can manipulate matter at the atomic level. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a literal description of the technology involved. Phase gates and subatomic infusers and temporal loop shrouds give a skilled Cryptek the ability to interact with the physical world at a resolution that makes conventional engineering look like hammering nails. The biological entity within the machine must not be disturbed. The Cryptek is in no hurry to wake it, not yet. First, the Cryptek wants to understand it. Understanding, for a Cryptek, means measurement, means analysis, means decomposing a thing into its component principles, and then reconstructing those principles into a model detailed enough to be predictive. The Cryptek has been doing this for 60 million years, to materials, to energy systems, to the fundamental forces that govern the physical universe, and the approach does not fundamentally change when the subject is a biological organism sealed inside an armored sarcophagus. It does, however, produce different feelings than the usual work. Or rather, and here, the Cryptek's self-analysis must acknowledge a level of imprecision that its instruments cannot resolve something that functions like a feeling, a variation in the processing state of its neural matrices that correlates with sustained engagement and does not match the patterns associated with routine analysis. The Cryptek files this observation alongside everything else and continues working. The scanning begins at the grossest level and proceeds toward the finest. At the gross level, the machine, the chassis, the weapon systems. The Cryptek can see clearly enough now to understand what each component is designed to do, and the design philosophy is, in its crude way, coherent. The rotary cannon arrangement on one arm is a weapon designed for saturation fire, overwhelming a target, with sheer volume of projectile rather than precision. The power fist on the other arm is a melee weapon, designed to close distance and strike with amplified force. The targeting systems in the shoulder mounts connect to the biological occupant's visual cortex, overlaying targeting data onto the organism's perceptions. The defensive systems, the thick ceramite plating, the reinforced joints, are designed to absorb damage that would destroy a lighter vehicle. The design philosophy is one the Cryptek recognizes from Necron-tier military history. They built things like this too, walking weapon platforms operated by sentient intelligence rather than simple programming, because sentient intelligence makes better tactical decisions than any automated system. The specific engineering differs. The underlying logic is the same. At the intermediate level, the interface, the Cryptek returns to this again, because it will not leave the Cryptek alone. The specific mechanism by which this organism's neurons connect to the machine's systems is, on examination, a piece of biological engineering that the Cryptek finds unexpectedly sophisticated. The black carapace, a name the Cryptek reconstructs from fragmentary Imperial records, is a synthetic organ implanted in the Space Marine's body during their transformation into an Astartes, designed specifically to interface with the systems of powered armor. And, in extreme cases such as this, the more extensive neural links of a machine like this one. It grows into the nervous system over years. It becomes, eventually, as much a part of the organism as any natural organ. The biological occupant did not choose this, the Cryptek notes. Or rather, it may have chosen to become what it is, but it could not have fully understood at the time of choosing what that transformation would ultimately lead to. The final step, the sealing in the machine's sarcophagus, came later, after some catastrophic injury or set of injuries that left the organism unable to survive outside the machine. But here it is, still alive. Still persisting. Still waiting for something, though, what it waited for. Here in this sealed chamber of an alien tomb, the Cryptek cannot yet determine. At the finest level, the biology itself. The Cryptek's sensors, at their most sensitive setting, can perceive things that no Imperial instrument currently in existence could register. The state of the organism's cells. The epigenetic markers that record something of the organism's history. The degradation patterns that indicate age, with a precision that the Cryptek finds useful. The organism is extremely old for its kind. The Astartes' lifespan, the Cryptek's records suggest, is extended compared to baseline human, potentially multiple centuries of active life, compared to the 8 or 9 decades that a standard human might expect. But even accounting for this extension, the cellular evidence suggests that the occupant of this machine is old, very old. And the dormancy periods are written into the cells in a way that the Cryptek finds fascinating. Extended periods of dramatically reduced metabolic activity, separated by periods of something closer to normal biological function. The pattern, spread across the available cellular evidence, suggests a history that matches almost exactly what the machine's design implies: long periods of sleep, punctuated by waking. The organism roused for some purpose, and then sealed back into dormancy, when the purpose was achieved, or abandoned, or made impossible. This organism has done this before. Many times. The dormancy in this chamber, however many centuries it may have lasted, is not the first dormancy the organism has experienced, perhaps not even close to the longest. The Cryptek sits with this information for a time. Then it reaches a conclusion. This organism is a practitioner of involuntary immortality. Not the willing, designed immortality of biotransference. Not the chosen extension of life through technology, but the accumulated accident of dormancy being sealed away from time's passage for long enough that time's usual effects become minimal. It has not been awake for most of the years that have passed since its creation. It has been preserved, as the Necrons are preserved, though by the cruder mechanism of metabolic suppression rather than the perfect suspension of stasis fields. Is this better or worse than what the Necrons have? The Cryptek does not usually ask questions it cannot immediately answer. The fact that this one sits unanswered in its analytical queue for several processing cycles says something about the question's depth. The Necrons have perfect stasis. Their biological substrate, what little biological substrate remains in the most senior of them, does not age in the Great Sleep. The warriors who wake in the 41st millennium are physically identical to the warriors who went into the sleep 60 million years ago. They have not aged. They have not changed. They are exactly what they were. But exactly what they were is a creature stripped of most of its soul. This organism, this space marine, sealed in its walking iron tomb, has aged. Its cells show the marks of time. It has changed, been shaped by whatever experiences punctuated the long dormancies. It is not what it was when it was first sealed in here. It is what time and experience have made it. The Cryptek cannot determine which of these is better. But the question is one that, for an entity whose entire species has been wrestling with the consequences of their particular choice for 60 million years, carries considerable weight. Eventually, the Cryptek accepts that the analysis has proceeded far enough for a preliminary conclusion. The organism can be kept alive indefinitely, with the supplemental systems now in place. The organism can be safely awakened, with appropriate precautions taken against the weapons systems of the machine becoming active before the occupant's mental state can be assessed, and the organism should be awakened. Not simply because it might have useful information about the tomb and its contents, though that is the justification the Cryptek uses in its report to the Overlord, but because the Cryptek has been studying it for 47 standard hours now, and the study has generated more questions than answers, and the only way to answer questions about a conscious being is to ask them. The Overlord approves the awakening. The Cryptek begins. Section 8. The Awakening the Dreadnought Stirs. Waking up inside a Dreadnought is not like waking up from sleep. There is nothing gradual about it. No slow transition from dream to reality. No gentle surfacing through layers of consciousness. There is simply darkness, and then something that is not darkness. But even that description is too clean. The reality of what it is to be the occupant of a Dreadnought chassis recovering from extreme dormancy is more confused than that, more fragmented, more frightening in the way that most frightening things are not with screaming terror, but with the quiet horror of profound disorientation. Consider what has just happened, or more precisely what is currently happening, to the organic component sealed in the chest of this machine. A brain that has been operating at a fraction of its normal metabolic rate for an indefinite period, potentially centuries, is now receiving biochemical signals to increase activity. Neurons that have been firing at minimal rates are suddenly being asked to fire more frequently. Blood, actual blood, biological blood, the archaic fluid that no Necron body has carried in 60 million years, is moving faster through vessels that have been dormant for very long periods. The experience of this is not like waking from sleep. It is more like being assembled. Like consciousness is being rebuilt from fragments that were scattered while the dormancy persisted, and the reassembly process is happening faster than the raw material can be properly organized. What arrives first, in the experience of returning consciousness, are the operational readouts. The brain of a space marine, extensively modified over years of surgical enhancement, has been trained and retrained to integrate the machine's sensor feeds directly into its cognition. This is the Black Carapace's primary function, not to make controlling the machine possible, but to make the transition between dormancy and operation fast. Fast enough that an emergency scramble from deep sleep to combat readiness can happen in seconds rather than minutes. It was designed for battlefields. The implementation here is imperfect after so long a dormancy, but the basic architecture is intact. The first thing that returns is something that might be called spatial awareness, but isn't quite that. It is the sense of the machine, not as a thing separate from the occupant, but as an extension of the occupant. The way you sense the position of your own limbs without looking at them. The massive ceramic body registers in the occupant's returning consciousness, not as equipment, but as self. Left arm, the assault cannon, currently powered down. Right arm, the power fist, currently inert. Lower extremities, the hydraulic legs, still functional, still bearing weight. Sensors coming online slowly, feeding data that at first amounts to nothing more than noise and gradually resolves into images. Stone walls, green light, darkness above, dust. The dim outlines of a chamber that is not familiar, has never been familiar, was the last thing seen before the long dark closed in. The occupant's consciousness, which is here, preserved, though thin and stretched, as old cloth processes, these sensory inputs through a mind that has been sleeping for longer than most civilizations exist, and is not, at this particular moment, functioning at any useful fraction of its normal capacity. Thoughts arrive slowly. Thoughts arrive without context. The process of placing the present moment in relation to past moments is one that takes time when those past moments are so far removed. What is happening? Where is this? How long? The neural interface, the connection between this flesh and blood consciousness and the machine that surrounds it, begins feeding more data as the power systems come more fully online. Power readings. Structural integrity. Weapon status, the assault cannon is powered down, The power fist is inactive, but the targeting systems are cycling up. The targeting systems bring something new, something that cuts through the fog of returning consciousness, like a cold blade. There are things in this room. They are not human. The targeting systems flag them automatically, the way they were designed to do, and the flag carries a category designation that updates as the systems pull from whatever recognition archives remain in the machine's memory banks. Xenos, Necron. Several Necron warriors standing at the chamber door. Their weapon systems, Gauss flares, the targeting system's note, and the tactical data that should be attached to that designation is slow to load. Slow to surface from the depth of the dormancy are not currently aimed inward. More importantly, there is something larger, standing in the center of the chamber, looking directly at the machine. The occupant's consciousness focuses, or tries to, through the visual sensors, on the thing that is looking back. It is Necron. The skeletal form is unmistakable. The viridian glow from the eye sockets clear and cold and unwavering. But it is not like the warriors at the door. It stands differently. Its bearing is different. The way it occupies space, the way it holds its body, the way its gaze, if gaze is the right word, for what comes from eyes that are not eyes, moves with deliberate assessment rather than automated threat response. This is something that thinks, something with purpose beyond programming, something that, by any meaningful definition, is a person. The occupant has fought Necrons before. The memories are in there, somewhere, though which battles and when and on what worlds are impossible to separate from the long blur of the dormancy. All the campaigns and conflicts and centuries compressed into a series of impressions. The impression of fighting Necrons is present, and it is not a comfortable impression. They were difficult to kill, the Necrons. They kept coming back, but they also were, in that particular campaign, or those particular campaigns, enemies. Things to be destroyed or driven away, or at least endured. This one is not moving to attack. Neither are the warriors at the door. Everything in the chamber is still, watching. The occupant processes this. Then, because the occupant is a space marine, a veteran of wars that spanned centuries, a being who has faced horrors that would unhinge most minds, and has done so with their sanity largely intact, the occupant does something that no automated system could do. The occupant thinks about the situation rather than simply reacting to it. Why would Necrons not attack? Because they want something, or because they are uncertain, or because the decision not to attack has been made by whatever the thing in the center of the chamber is, and the warriors obey it. All of these things are possible. None of them necessarily mean this is survivable. But the fact that the assault cannon is unpowered and has not been powered up suggests that whatever decision has been made about whether the occupant of this machine lives or dies, it has gone, at least for now, in the direction of lives. The machine's voice systems are functional. The targeting data indicates that the entity in the center of the chamber has been standing there for some time. The dust patterns in the area suggest it has not moved since the occupant's consciousness began to return. It has been waiting. The occupant decides to speak. The first attempt produces nothing useful. The vocal systems require a moment of calibrel of impression that the decades of dormancy have disrupted. The second attempt produces a sound, but a rough one, the mechanical voice that the machine's speakers generate in place of human speech ground and distorted by whatever degradation has occurred in the audio systems over the centuries. The third attempt is clearer. It is a single word in Gothic. Where? Not a question, exactly, not quite. More of an acknowledgement that orientation is required, that the process of establishing where this is and what has happened has begun. The response that comes back is not in Gothic. But the machine's translation systems, another of the capabilities that had been built into it, because these machines were designed to operate across multiple theaters of conflict, against multiple types of enemy, are working well enough to begin a parse. The language is old, older than any language in the machine's translation catalog. But old enough languages leave traces in the languages that descended from them, and the patterns are there, even if the specific vocabulary is not, and the context fills in gaps that the vocabulary cannot. The response is not what the occupant expected. The response is, in the machine's best reconstruction, something like, approximately, "You are in a place of sleep. You have been here for some time. I am curious about why." And the occupant processes this. And the occupant considers. And then the occupant, who has spent more time than any human should spend in the strange, timeless quiet of a dreadnought's existence. Thinks about the concept of something that sleeps for 60 million years, asking a creature that sleeps for centuries why it chose to do what it did. The occupant does something else that no automated system could manage. The occupant almost laughs. Long story. The machine's speakers produce. The viridian eyes in the center of the chamber do not change expression. Necron faces cannot change expression in the biological sense. But something in the set of the Overlord's posture shifts, infinitesimally. And the cryptech, standing at the threshold of the chamber, watching all of this with the focused attention of a scientist who has just watched the beginning of an experiment, notes it, and files it. The Overlord has time for long stories. It always has. Section 9. A conversation across the void of time. What follows is not exactly a conversation, not in the way that conversation implies equals, exchanging information and perspective in mutual good faith for mutual benefit. The Necron Overlord holds every advantage in this encounter. The occupant of the Dreadnought is in the Overlord's tomb, in a chamber the Overlord's forces surround, with weapon systems that could reduce the Dreadnought chassis to scrap metal before the assault cannon could be brought online. The occupant has no allies, no position, no leverage of any kind, except the single fact that the Overlord has chosen to keep it alive, which is a form of leverage only in the sense that it represents something the Overlord could remove. And yet, the Overlord does not press its advantages. The Overlord has infinite patience, 60 million years of practice with infinite patience, and the curiosity that is currently occupying the primary attention of its analytical matrices is not the curiosity of a predator studying prey. It is something more careful than that, more considered. There is a famous Necron character, known across the dynasty networks that have been sharing intelligence since the awakenings began, called Trazyn the Infinite. The Overlord of this tomb world is not Trazyn. Trazyn's particular obsession with collecting, with preserving, with the curation of history as physical artifact is idiosyncratic in a way that most Necron overlords find mildly embarrassing and occasionally useful when a historically significant item needs to be recovered from some inconvenient location. But Trazyn's underlying motivation resonates across Necron culture in ways that are easy to dismiss and difficult to fully account for. Trazyn collects because memory fails, because even a Necron overlord, with the finest necrodermis neural matrix that 60 million years of technology can produce, does not perfectly retain everything. The Great Sleep has eroded things. The biotransference eroded things before that. What is left of the Necrontier in any individual overlord is an imperfect reconstruction, and even that imperfect reconstruction is wearing thin with time. In Trazyn's case, the response to this is to externalize memory, to build a collection that is itself the record, so that the forgetting of the mind is compensated for by the permanence of the object. His galleries on Solemnace contain not just artifacts, but living beings preserved in stasis, witnesses to events that would otherwise have passed without any witness, historical moments crystallized in amber that Trazyn considers his personal responsibility to the universe's continuity. Most overlords who are aware of Trazyn's practices regard them as eccentric at best, deranged at worst. But all of them, if honest, and Necrons are not usually dishonest with themselves, because self-deception requires a degree of emotional investment in outcomes that most of them can no longer fully muster, would have to acknowledge that the thing Trazyn is afraid of is the same thing they are all afraid of. The fear that what you were is being lost, and that lost things cannot be recovered, and that the Necrons are losing themselves so slowly and so completely that most of them have already lost the ability to notice. This overlord does not collect in Trazyn's fashion. But the overlord understands the fear that drives the collecting. And the thing in the chamber, the machine with its improbable occupant, its ancient inscriptions of battles and honors, its centuries of sealed isolation, is a record of a kind that even Trazyn might pause to consider. Not because of what the occupant knows about the Imperium, or the Horus Heresy, or any tactical matter, but because of what it is. An example of a different answer to the same question. A living proof that another path was taken, and what that path cost, and what it preserved. So, they communicate, through through the machine's translation systems and the Overlord's own extensive linguistic analysis capabilities. The Necron were linguists, as well as warriors and engineers, for a civilization that spans star systems, needs to communicate across it, and the exchange that results is halting and imprecise and missing much on both sides. And somehow, despite all of this, real. The Overlord establishes the basic facts first. Location. This world, this tomb, this chamber, in a sealed section of the maintenance corridors. Duration. The Overlord's own timekeeping systems, now synchronizing with external astronomical data as the tomb world fully awakens, place the current date in what the Imperium calls the 41st millennium. The occupant's response to this is a prolonged silence that the machine's systems interpret as either processing or distress, possibly both. The Overlord understands, from context and from its own experience, what it means to be told that thousands of years have passed while you were absent from them. It has been told something similar, 60 million years, not thousands, and the processing that took was extensive. The occupant asks about the Imperium. The Overlord's answer is carefully neutral, describing what it knows of the Imperium's current state in purely factual terms. It exists, it is large, it is embattled by many enemies, including the Necrons themselves. The Overlord notes, but does not comment on, the way the occupant's machine body's power output fluctuates very slightly at certain pieces of information, the equivalent of an involuntary physical reaction. Relief, perhaps, that the Imperium exists at all, or something more complicated than relief. The occupant asks how it came to be in this place. The Overlord's answer is that it does not know entirely, that it has reconstructed what it can from the physical evidence, and it describes what it has reconstructed. The chamber was sealed from the inside. The life support system was designed for very long operation. The occupant arrived here, or arranged to be brought here, deliberately. There is a long pause while the occupant's processing systems work on this. Then something emerges from the machine's speakers that is not quite language. An audio recording, the cryptech realizes, stored in the machine's memory banks and now played back the sound quality, is degraded by centuries of storage, but it is recognizable as a human voice, not the filtered mechanical tones the machine produces now, but an actual organic voice, speaking in a language that the translator handles imperfectly. The content, as best the cryptech can reconstruct. A name. The occupant's name, given in the ancient tradition of Space Marine chapters, with the name of the chapter attached, and then a date in the imperial calendar that the cryptech notes and calculates against astronomical reference points. The date is old, very old by imperial reckoning. The Horus Heresy era, or very close to it. This machine has been here since the Horus Heresy, or shortly after. The cryptech transmits this conclusion to the Overlord. The Overlord receives it without visible reaction, but the Overlord asks the occupant, through the halting translation interface, the question that this conclusion raises: why here? The response takes a long time. Not because the translation is difficult, the systems have improved across the hours of conversation, building a working lexicon from context and pattern matching, but because the answer is not simple. The occupant's speakers produce something that might be, in better translation, something like this. There was a battle. There were brothers. There was a mission that required going somewhere that few could follow, and from which returning was uncertain. The machine was brought to this place, this world, this specific location, possibly already known to be a Necron site from the fragmentary intelligence that existed even then about such things, and sealed in. Because the world was dead, no one would look here. Because it was underground, if something went wrong, it would not matter. And if the Imperium survived, and here the occupant's systems produce a word that the translation handles as something like faith or certainty, though neither is precise when the Imperium survived and sent someone to look, there was a record of where to look. The machine produces something from its storage systems, a data format that is entirely incompatible with Necron data reading technology. A file of some kind, the cryptech determines, compressed and stored in the machine's own archive, in the hope that it would eventually be found by someone who could read it. No one came. Not in the centuries that passed. No one with the ability to read that file found this place. The Overlord processes this narrative for a time. Then it asks, With the bluntness of an entity that has not practiced social delicacy in 60 million years and does not see the need to start now, what the occupant intended to do now, given that the situation it had been sealed in to wait for had apparently not arrived. The occupant's response is a long silence. Then something that the translation system renders as, approximately, what does anything sealed in for a long time do when it is finally unsealed by something it did not expect? Figure out what there is to do next. The Overlord is quiet for a moment. Something moves through the ancient entity's engrammatic patterns, some resonance with the occupant's words that goes past the mere information content and touches something that the Overlord has spent 60 million years carrying, mostly without acknowledging. The Overlord went into the Great Sleep with an intention, to wake when the time was right and reclaim what had been lost. The time has come. The Overlord has woken. And what confronts the Overlord is not what was expected, a galaxy waiting to be reclaimed, younger species stepping aside for their ancient masters, but a galaxy full of busy, stubborn, complicated life that has no intention of stepping aside, and an ancient Necron civilization that is trying to reassemble itself from the damage of 60 million years, and not finding it as easy as the Silent King's original order seemed to suggest. The Overlord too woke up and found that things were different from the plan. The Overlord too is figuring out what there is to do next. This parallel does not make the Overlord sympathetic to the Space Marine in any soft or sentimental sense. Necron Overlords are not soft or sentimental, but it creates a context of recognition, a context in which two very old things that have slept a very long time sit in the same chamber and acknowledge, without quite saying so in either of their languages, that the experience of waking up into a changed world is one that they share. The conversation continues for hours. The Overlord asks about the Horus Heresy, and the occupant describes what it knows, which is from that era, which is the perspective of someone who was there, which means it is more direct and immediate than any imperial historical record the Overlord has encountered. The Overlord asks about the Primarchs, and the occupant has memories fragmentary, worn thin by time, but real of beings that the galaxy now regards as mythological or divine. Beings who were in this occupant's experience simply commanders, great and terrible and human in ways that the legends about them have since obscured. The Overlord files all of this with the careful attention of a conqueror who understands that intelligence about an enemy's history and self-mythology is worth having. But the Overlord also asks things that are not purely strategic. It asks about the experience of dormancy, the machine's dormancy, the centuries of the occupant lying in the dark between states of consciousness. The occupant answers carefully, not fully trusting, but not fully guarded either. The machine's dormancy is, the occupant says, not rest, not relief. It is absence, a gap in experience, a hole in the narrative of existence. The occupant describes waking from it as disorienting in a specific way. You go in knowing one set of things and wake up in a world where some of those things are no longer true, and you cannot tell which ones have changed without looking. The occupant describes this with a precision that suggests long familiarity, the familiarity of someone who has done it many times. The Overlord, for the first time in this conversation, offers something that is not a question or an instruction. It offers a response that matches the occupant's description with one of its own. The Great Sleep, the Overlord says. Approximating this in terms the translation system can handle was not what was intended. What was intended was a planned period of waiting, after which the Necrons would emerge fully functional, fully organized, fully prepared. What happened was the loss of much of that. Tomb worlds destroyed. Warriors damaged beyond repair. Nobles woken in fractured states, their personalities worn by time in ways the finest necrodermis bodies could not entirely prevent. The waking has been imperfect. The Overlord woke not into the galaxy the Silent King promised, but into something messier, something more uncertain. The occupant listens to this or receives it through the translation system, which amounts to the same thing, and there is another of those fractional fluctuations in the machine's power output. Then, the machine's speakers produce something unexpected, something that the translation system renders imperfectly but recognizably as, "I know that feeling." The Overlord is still for a moment. The Cryptek, watching from the threshold, notes the stillness and notes what comes after it, a very subtle reconfiguration of the Overlord's posture, a change so small that only a being looking for it would detect it. If the Overlord were asked to name what it felt in that moment, it would not use the word understood. Necron overlords do not easily claim to be understood by beings of lesser standing or different species. But there is a word that the Necron language had, before biotransference simplified everything, that the Overlord's deep engrammatic archive still contains. A word for the specific experience of recognizing yourself in something entirely unlike yourself. The Overlord does not say this word, but it is there. The conversation continues. Section 10. What the machine cannot forget. Hours become days. The occupant of the Dreadnought remains in the chamber, suspended in the supplemental life support system the Cryptek has installed, more alert now, but still not fully functional, still working through the fog of a dormancy longer than most Imperial dynasties. The Overlord visits each day, if day means anything underground, in a tomb complex, which it does not in any literal sense, but which serves as a useful frame. The conversations deepen. The Cryptek has been busy in the meantime. The Cryptek has been analyzing everything the conversations have produced, filtering it for the factual content that can be verified or cross-referenced against other data sources, and setting aside everything that cannot. But the Cryptek has also been doing something else, something that is harder to categorize as normal Cryptek behavior, which usually concerns itself with the material and the measurable. The Cryptek has been thinking about the occupant's nature. What it means to have been what this organism was, human or close to human, though extensively modified, and then to have undergone the transformation into an Astartes, which is itself a kind of biotransference, though one that leaves significantly more of the original intact, and then to have undergone the further transformation of interment in the Dreadnought chassis, which is another reduction of the original, more restricted, more mechanical, more dependent on external systems, and then to have slept. The question that will not leave the Cryptek is this: what does the occupant still feel? The Necrons lost, in biotransference, the ability to feel in anything like the way they once did. What remains for the Overlords and Crypteks, who retain their personalities, is a faint echo of feeling, a ghost of the emotional architecture that their Necron bodies once supported. They can experience something that resembles preference, something that resembles satisfaction or frustration or the dry, distilled residue of what was once pride. But the full spectrum is gone. The living texture of experience is gone. The Dreadnought occupant has not lost the same things. The modification is less total. The biological substrate that supports emotion is still there, still functioning, still processing experience in at least some approximation of the way it was designed to. The dormancy has compressed the experience of time, but not eliminated the capacity for experience when awake. The occupant still feels. The Cryptek does not know what to do with this information. There is no analytical framework in its vast store of knowledge that helps it process the envy, if that is even the right word, that arises when confronting the fact that a creature 4,000 years old and less than 3 meters tall retains more of what it means to be alive than the Cryptek does after 60 million years. The Cryptek files this too, files it, and returns to work, and does not mention it to the Overlord. Some analyses are not ready to be shared. Meanwhile, in the chamber, the occupant continues to recover and to speak with the Overlord, and the days accumulate, and something that is not quite a relationship, but is some form of provisional recognition, some mutual agreement to exchange the truth of experience rather than tactical deceptions, develops between the ancient conqueror and the ancient warrior in the ancient machine. The Overlord learns things it did not know about the Horus Heresy, and files them with the care of someone who understands that knowing your enemy's history better than they know it themselves is a form of power. The Overlord learns things about the Adeptus Astartes, about how they function, and how they think, and what they believe, and why they fight the way they fight, that the Overlord cannot simply obtain from intelligence assessments, because intelligence assessments do not capture interiority. The Overlord learns these things and understands that the Imperium it will face in the years to come is not simply a political and military entity, but a civilization with depth and history, and the specific kind of stubbornness that only comes from having survived things that should have been unsurvivable. This makes the Overlord's campaign calculations more sophisticated, not less optimistic. The Overlord was never naive about the difficulty of reconquest. But precision is valuable. The occupant learns things too. It learns that the tomb world it is in has been here since before humanity existed in any meaningful form. It learns that the force sleeping around it is vast and ancient and patient in a way that no imperial war machine can truly match. It learns, from context and inference, if not from direct statement, that the Overlord is not cruel in the way that many enemies of the Imperium are cruel, is not motivated by hate or hunger or the dark passions of chaos. The Overlord is motivated by the ancient imperative of reconquest and the cold arithmetic of strategy, and the occupant finds this simultaneously more comprehensible and, in a specific way, more frightening. Pure strategy is not constrained by the passions that limit other kinds of enemies, but the occupant also notices something. Something that the Overlord has not said directly, but which accumulates across the conversations, the way frost accumulates on metal in cold air, building through many tiny additions until it is undeniable. The Overlord is lonely in a way that no single conversation can fix, and that 60 million years have not resolved. The Necrons are, by their nature, isolated even from each other. Their emotional capacity is so reduced by biotransference that the bonds that form between them are pale things compared to what they might have been. The Overlord commands loyalty. The Overlord receives obedience. The Overlord does not have friends, or loves, or the rich texture of relationships that a biological being takes for granted. Even before the Great Sleep, the Overlord existed in the thinned-out emotional world that biotransference created. 60 million years in a deep sleep have not added anything to that world. The occupant, who has spent 4,000 years cycling through dormancy and brief waking and more dormancy, understands something about the accumulation of absence, understands what it is to carry the loss of connection, to be cut off from the web of relationships that gives life its texture. The Dreadnought's existence is isolating in its own way. The machine body creates distance from other beings, makes simple touch impossible, makes the shared experience of eating and drinking and sleeping in proximity to others a memory rather than a reality. The two of them are not the same. They are not alike in any way that erases the fundamental difference between a human consciousness and a Necron one, between the Imperium and the Necron dynasties, between what they are and what they want for the galaxy. But they are both old, and both preserved against their full will, and both carrying losses that time has not healed. The occupant does not say any of this directly. Space Marines, whatever else they are not prone to expressing vulnerability to Xenos entities in sealed Necron tombs. But the occupant thinks it. The occupant turns it over in the consciousness that the machine's body houses and finds it real. There is one more thing the occupant carries into this situation that the Overlord does not yet know and may never fully understand. Not a tactical fact, not a piece of intelligence about the Imperium or the Horus Heresy, or the specific events that led the occupant to this place. Something more personal than that. The occupant remembers brothers. Not as names, most of the names are gone, worn smooth by time and dormancy, until only impressions remain, but as a quality of relationship that the machine cannot replicate and the isolation cannot erase. The specific weight of shared purpose, of standing in a line with others who chose the same thing you chose, who were trained to the same pitch of capability and dedication, who would die for you in the same instant you would die for them. The Astartes bond is not human friendship, exactly. It is something more deliberate than that, built through processes that are more like forging than growing. But it is real, and it was once the primary thing that defined the occupant's existence, more real than the battles or the victories, or the accumulated battle honors inscribed on the machine's hull. All of that is gone. The brothers are gone, 4,000 years gone, long dead in the ordinary way, rather than preserved in a machine in an alien tomb. The occupant is the only one of them left, and it has been left alone so long that the memory of not being alone has become a kind of ghost, present but weightless, real in the way that things are real in dreams. The Overlord cannot replace this. The cryptech's fascination cannot replace this. The strange provisional recognition that has developed across the hours of conversation is not this, but it is something that is oriented in the same direction, something that acknowledges the occupant's existence as meaningful rather than merely factual. And in the context of 4,000 years of isolation, that acknowledgement matters more than the occupant wants to admit. The occupant does not mention any of this to the Overlord, but the Overlord, whose analytical matrices are exceptionally sensitive to the indicators of emotional states in biological beings, notices the particular quality of the occupant's silences in certain moments, and files what it notices with the same careful attention it gives to everything else. This also is archived. This also is, in its way, preserved. Section 11. The question of what happens next. The tomb world is waking up. This is not a slow or gentle process. While the Overlord and the occupant of the Dreadnought conduct their strange hours-long exchange, the revivification protocols are running throughout the complex. Thousands of Necron warriors emerging from their stasis alcoves. Not all at once, the revivification process is staggered, designed to bring warriors online gradually, to avoid the power demands of simultaneous activation, overwhelming the tomb's energy systems. First, the security forces, the Immortals and Lichguard, whose job is to protect the nobles as they wake. Then, the bulk of the warrior legions, in waves timed to the energy reserve's recovery cycle. Then, the specialized forces, the Deathmarks, with their dimensional snipers, the Flayed Ones, who are always a problem to release, and an even bigger problem to contain, the Destroyers, who must be managed carefully, because the particular madness biotransference instilled in them makes them dangerous to their own side, if not properly directed. Canoptech Spiders, recalibrating their maintenance routines, from the long minimal maintenance posture of the Great Sleep to the more active posture of an awakened dynasty. The tomb is coming alive in the same way that a vast machine comes alive slowly at first, with false starts and partial failures and the grinding complaint of systems that have been in standby mode for so long that bringing them online fully requires careful management. But, inexorably, with the momentum of something that was designed for precisely this, that has been building to precisely this through 60 million years of patient waiting. This world's human inhabitants, if there are any, and the initial surface scans suggest there may be, will begin to notice things. Seismic activity of an unusual character. Regular, rhythmic, too precise to be geological. Power fluctuations in any electrical systems built within range of the tomb's energy grid, which extends for several kilometers from the complex's outermost boundaries through the rock. Equipment failing for no reason, then restarting. Communications becoming unreliable. Animals behaving strangely, not because they can detect the Necrons directly, not because any of them is sensitive to necrodermis or the energies the tomb complex produces, but because the subtle disturbances that the awakening creates in local geology and electromagnetic fields produce changes in the environment that prey animals evolve to be sensitive to. Something is wrong, in ways they cannot articulate. They leave. If the human inhabitants are sophisticated enough to have Imperial monitoring systems, those systems will eventually produce alerts. If those alerts reach the right people, the Adeptus Mechanicus, who have spent considerable effort developing detection methodologies for dormant Necron sites, or the Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition, whose specialty includes exactly this kind of ancient alien threat, there will be a response. The response will likely involve Space Marines, because the Imperium's response to most threats involves Space Marines, and Necron tomb worlds in particular require the kind of force projection that only the Adeptus Astartes can provide on the relevant timescales. The irony of Space Marines arriving on this world to confront a waking Necron tomb, while a Space Marine, an ancient, 4,000-year-old Space Marine, in a Horus Heresy-era Dreadnought chassis, sits in a sealed chamber inside that tomb. Having a philosophical conversation with the Overlord is not lost on the Cryptech. The Cryptech notes it and files it. The Cryptech has been doing a great deal of filing lately. The tomb world is waking up. This is not a slow or gentle process. The Overlord must attend to this. The awakening dynasty has priorities that supersede any particular conversation, any particular curiosity, any particular occupant of any particular chamber in the tomb's sealed sections. The Overlord has an empire to rebuild, or at least begin rebuilding. It has strategic assessments to perform, force dispositions to plan, communications to initiate with other awakening dynasties across the network. But there is the question of what to do about the thing in the sealed chamber. This is, the Overlord reflects, a genuinely novel problem. The Necrons have protocols for almost everything that they might encounter how to handle the humans who sometimes infest their awakening tomb worlds, how to respond to Eldari interference, what to do when tyrannid organisms begin to consume a planet that a dynasty has decided it wants. There are no protocols for finding a several millennia-old space marine in an ancient dreadnought chassis, sealed into a previously unknown chamber of a newly awakening tomb complex, who has been sustaining itself on failing life support for an undetermined period of centuries. The options are simple to enumerate. Destroy the machine and its occupant, which removes any potential security concern. Release the machine and its occupant onto the surface, which potentially alerts whatever Imperial presence exists on this world more quickly than would otherwise occur. Keep the occupant as something a prisoner, a specimen, a curiosity in the tomb indefinitely, which creates ongoing logistical and security considerations. Or something else. The Overlord considers the fourth option. It is the one that the Cryptex analysis has been quietly suggesting since the early hours of the examination, the one that the conversations have been slowly making more concrete, the one that does not fit easily into any existing protocol, because it has no existing protocol. The occupant of the Dreadnought is not a threat, in any immediate tactical sense. The machine's weapon systems, while formidable, are a single system against an awakening Necron dynasty. The occupant's knowledge is valuable but finite. There are limits to what even a 4,000-year-old space marine can know about the current state of the galaxy, especially one that has been asleep for centuries. But the occupant is a record, an account, a direct witness to things that occurred 4,000 years ago, the kind of primary source that even the Necron's own vast archives cannot replicate. And the occupant's perspective on things, on consciousness, on preservation, on the experience of being maintained in a form not fully chosen, on what is lost and kept when a being undergoes fundamental transformation, is one that the Cryptech finds worth continuing to study, and that the Overlord, though it would not frame it in these terms, finds worth continuing to hear. The Overlord makes a decision. For now, the occupant remains. The supplemental life support stays active. The chamber door, the ceramite one, not Necron tier manufacture, crude by comparison, is replaced with something more appropriate, something that seals better and will last longer. The occupant's status in the complex's master program is updated. Unknown entity, dormant, life support maintained, no action required. The Overlord communicates this decision to the occupant directly, in the halting translation interface that has improved somewhat over the days of use. The occupant is told that it will not be destroyed, that it will be maintained, that it is welcome, and the Overlord uses something like this word, though the precise Necron tier concept is not quite welcome so much as permitted to remain, which in the context of a Necron dynasty is about as close to welcome as the language accommodates to remain in this chamber for as long as it chooses. The occupant, the machine's sensors show, spends a very long time processing this response. Then the speakers produce something that the translation system renders as, "And what do you expect in return?" The Overlord considers. Conversation, the Overlord says, which is the honest answer. Perspective, which is the strategic answer. And perhaps something the Overlord does not say aloud, but that the occupant, paying close attention, might hear in the spaces around the words, the particular comfort of speaking to something that has also been preserved against its full choosing, and that is trying, across the enormous distance of every difference that exists between them, to figure out what to do with the time that remains. The occupant is quiet for a moment. Then the machine's old and worn speakers, still gravelly with the accumulated damage of centuries, produce something that might be agreement or might be the beginnings of it. They will speak more. That much is decided. What the occupant will ask for in return, because nothing comes without cost, and old warriors know that better than anyone is not yet clear. Perhaps passage to the surface, eventually. Perhaps information, perhaps only to be heard. Space Marines are not given to articulating need easily, and this one has been alone in the dark for a very long time. But the beginning is made. The strange companionship, if it can be called that, between the ancient conqueror who gave up flesh for metal 60 million years ago and is still, in the deepest part of its engrammatic matrix, grieving for what was lost, and the ancient warrior who was sealed into metal to preserve flesh that could no longer survive without it, is established. The Canoptech spiders continue their rounds. The viridian lights pulse their slow, eternal pulse. The tomb continues to wake. And in the hidden chamber, in the sealed section of the maintenance corridor that the master program has now been updated to include in its patrol routes, an old machine that houses something older than it stands and breathes the slow, regulated breath of the barely living and waits to see what the next waking brings. Section 12. The weight of what is carried. There is a question that sits underneath every other question in this story, and it is time to address it directly. What does it mean to carry consciousness through time, in a vessel that was not the original home of that consciousness? Before we answer that, we need to sit with the question itself a little longer, because it is a question the 41st millennium is asking in a dozen different ways simultaneously, and most of the people living in it never get to examine it from the outside. Every space marine who has ever been entombed in a dreadnought has faced this question from inside, where it is not philosophical, but visceral. Every Necron who has ever woken from the Great Sleep has faced it from inside too, though with a different kind of interior, an interior that biotransference has already reshaped so completely that the very capacity to feel the wrongness of the answer has been reduced. But here, in this chamber, both perspectives are present simultaneously. The Dreadnought occupant faces the question from inside the machine's constraints, with the full emotional weight of organic consciousness that has not been stripped by biotransference, with the grief and the loneliness and the specific particular burden of centuries of isolation. The Necron overlord faces the question from inside its own constraints, with the analytical power of a mind that has 60 million years of experience, but with the emotional hollowness that biotransference installed and the Great Sleep deepened. Neither one is in the best position to understand what it is like to be the other, but both are in positions that the other might, with some effort, recognize. It is a question that the Necrons have answered one way. They transferred their minds into metal bodies, and the metal bodies carried the minds forward through 60 million years. But in the process, the fullness of those minds was reduced, stripped of the qualities that required biological substrate to sustain the warmth, the capacity for sensation, the dense emotional life that organic chemistry supports in ways that no necrodermis neural matrix has quite been able to replicate. They are still there. They are still themselves. But they are diminished in ways that the finest bodies, the most sophisticated engrammatic patterns, the highest concentration of processing capability, cannot fully compensate for. The Dreadnought tradition answers the same question differently. The body, the biological original, broken and failing though it is kept. It is surrounded. It is sustained. The machine does not replace the original. It extends the original's reach, provides it with a body capable of continuing to function in environments and engagements that the biological original's broken form cannot survive. The consciousness inside a dreadnought has not been transferred into the machine. It has been given the machine as a supplemental existence, an additional layer between it and the universe, while remaining what it originally was. The cost of this approach is different from the Necron cost. The dreadnought occupant still feels, still grieves, still carries the full weight of organic consciousness, including all the burdens that organic consciousness entails. The isolation that the machine creates is experienced as isolation, not processed as a tactical parameter. The centuries of dormancy are experienced as loss, as absence, as the ongoing accumulation of a debt that existence cannot repay. The Necrons are numb to their loss. The dreadnought occupant is not numb to anything. Which is worse, the numbness or the feeling? This is the question that the Cryptek has been wrestling with, in the spaces between its other work, since the first hour of the examination. It is not a question the Cryptek can answer definitively, because the comparison requires having experienced both states, and the Cryptek has only experienced one. But the Cryptek can observe the other, and what the Cryptek observes is this. The dreadnought occupant, despite everything, despite 4,000 years of intermittent existence, despite the loss of everything that once defined a normal life for anything biological, despite the growing accumulation of dormancy and isolation, and the particular burden of being a consciousness inside a machine, is still oriented toward the world, still curious about it, still engaged with what happens around it. Still, in whatever attenuated way the machine's existence permits, alive to life, the Necrons retain their purposes, the overlords retain their ambitions, The cryptechs retain their curiosity. But the warmth, the quality of genuine engagement with existence, the thing that makes living feel like living rather than simply functioning that warmth, is mostly absent. The Overlord's curiosity about the Dreadnought occupant is real, but it is thin in a way that the cryptech, with the analytical honesty that defines its function, has to acknowledge. There is something the occupant has that the Overlord does not. Something that biotransference took and the Great Sleep deepened the absence of. Something that no necrodermis body, however sophisticated, has fully restored to any Necron who went through the furnaces 60 million years ago. The cryptech does not have a word for it, in either Necrontier or Gothic, but the concept exists in both languages. In Gothic, something like soul, though the word has accumulated so much religious weight in that language that using it seems to import implications that may not be warranted. In Necrontier, something older and more specific, the word from before biotransference, that meant the particular quality of a conscious being that was not reducible to its constituent processes. The word from the inscriptions on the sarcophagi, the word that described what the ancient artificers were trying to preserve and what the Cetan consumed. The cryptech files this analysis with a notation that it is not yet complete and may never be. Some questions outlast the beings who first ask them. The tomb continues to wake. The world above stirs with the first signs that something ancient and terrible is rising beneath its surface. Somewhere in the complex, the Great Phase Gate activates for the first time in 60 million years and sends a burst of tachyon data across the galaxy to other awakening dynasties, announcing that this world is alive again, and this dynasty is rising, and the great work of reconquest is beginning. And in the hidden chamber, something old and strange and unprecedented persists. The Overlord will return to speak more. The cryptech will continue its analysis. The warriors at the door will stand their vigil, mindless and patient. The Canoptech scarabs will flow past the chamber entrance on their maintenance routes, and the Canoptech spiders will include this section in their patrol cycles now, and the tomb will slowly come fully alive around this one quiet center. The Dreadnought in the hidden chamber does not know what will happen next. 4,000 years of history have taught it that certainty about what comes next is not something the universe provides freely. What it knows is that it is still here, still thinking, still carrying the weight of everything it has ever known, and everyone it has ever lost, and every battle it has ever survived, into a present that could not have been predicted from any of those things. Still, in the machine's battered and centuries-worn way, alive. That has always had to be enough, and in the strange calculus of existence in the 41st millennium, it still is. There is an old principle in space marine philosophy, passed from ancient to ancient in the deep halls where the dreadnoughts sleep between battles, transmitted in the grinding mechanical voices that are the only voices these beings still have. Only in death does duty end. In this chamber, on this awakening world, beneath the light of a sun that went about its ordinary business, while 60 million years passed underground, that principle meets something that the space marine tradition did not quite account for. Something that adds a dimension to it. What do you do when duty has not ended, but everything you knew the duty for has changed almost beyond recognition? What do you do when you wake up in an enemy's tomb, and the enemy is not entirely what you expected, and the galaxy is not entirely what you remember, and the certainty that once made duty feel like a clear and simple thing has been replaced by the 60 million year patience of something ancient and waiting and unexpectedly curious? You figure out what there is to do next, and you start from where you are. Section 13. The deeper parallel, two kinds of immortality. Let us step back from the immediate story, from the chamber, from the conversations, from the Overlord and the cryptech and the machine with its sleeping occupant, and look at what this encounter illuminates about the nature of the two civilizations involved. The comparison is instructive, precisely because neither civilization would want to be compared to the other. The Necrons regard the Imperium as a temporary occupation of territory they consider theirs by right of prior claim and superior technology. The Imperium regards the Necrons as one of the great existential threats to human civilization, ancient and implacable, and terrifyingly difficult to kill. Both of these assessments have truth in them. Neither is the whole truth. What is the whole truth? The whole truth is that both of these civilizations were built around the problem of mortality. The Necron tier wanted to stop dying so badly that they were willing to pay any price, and the price turned out to be everything that made living worthwhile. The Imperium was built by the Emperor in an era so violent and chaotic that survival was itself the primary mission. And the thing they preserved was built around the principle of enduring at any cost, and the cost, paid out across 10,000 years of endless war, has been almost everything except endurance. Both civilizations have been shaped by loss, by the particular kind of loss that comes from choosing survival over the quality of what is survived for. The Necron Empire, at its height, was the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever produced. Their technology was, in most respects, thousands of years ahead of anything that exists in the 41st millennium. They fought and won a war against beings who could extinguish suns and manipulate the warp as easily as a human breathes. They imprisoned gods, they ruled a galaxy, and then they gave away what made them able to want any of this in the first place. The biotransference was the pivotal act of Necron history, the hinge on which everything turned. Before it, the Necron tier were mortal, dying, angry, brilliant, and fully alive in all the messy, complicated ways that organic consciousness entails. After it, they were immortal, undying, enormously powerful, and emptied of most of what had driven them to seek that power. They got what they wanted and lost what they needed it for. The Dreadnought tradition of the Adeptus Astartes represents a fundamentally different approach to the same underlying problem. How do you preserve what is valuable in a mortal being when the mortal body fails? The Necrons chose total replacement, burn away the flesh, transfer the pattern, lose the soul. The Dreadnoughts chose supplemental preservation, keep what remains of the flesh, build around it, lose the freedom, but not the feeling. Neither approach is clean. Neither approach is truly what any of the beings involved would have freely chosen if there had been a third option. The third option, to simply be biological, fully alive, fully embodied, and fully mortal, is the one that neither tradition makes available to its practitioners. The Necrons cannot go back to mortality. The Dreadnought occupant cannot go back to a body that functions without the machine. Both exist in a state that is defined as much by what it is not, as by what it is. But the difference between them is not trivial, and the galaxy in which the 41st millennium takes place is shaped by that difference, in ways that are easy to miss if you are only looking at the armies and the weapons and the territorial ambitions. The Necrons are trying to reclaim a galaxy. They are doing so with enormous competence and ancient strategic patience and technology that the Imperium cannot match piece for piece. They are also doing so as beings who are, in the most fundamental sense, incomplete. 60 million years of the Great Sleep deepened losses that were already profound. The Necrons, who wake in the 41st millennium, are fragments of what the Necron tier were, capable in battle, sophisticated in planning, but thinned in the dimension of experience that makes conquest meaningful to the beings doing the conquering. The Imperium is trying to survive. It is doing so with a desperation that would be merely pathetic if it were not backed by the particular kind of stubbornness that only arises from civilizations that have survived things that should have killed them many times over. The Adeptus Astartes are not the Necrons' technological equals. They are not the Necrons' strategic equals in any cold analytical sense, but the Necrons' analytical matrices have not found a way to fully account for the motivation that comes from still being able to feel what you are fighting for. The attachment to life, to brotherhood, to the specific faces of specific people that makes fighting not merely a programmed response, but a choice. The Dreadnought in the hidden chamber is, in miniature, the distillation of this difference. Here is a being whose body failed so catastrophically that it required a machine to survive. A being who has been in that machine for 4,000 years, sleeping more than waking, losing more and more of the texture of a normal existence with every passing century. A being who could, by almost any reasonable assessment, be said to have already lost most of what makes life worth living. And yet, when the Overlord asks questions, the Dreadnought answers with a directness that is not mechanical. When the translation system fails and the communication breaks down into fragments, the Dreadnought does not simply halt and wait for the system to improve. It tries different approaches. It reaches for metaphors. It works at the problem of being understood, because being understood still matters to it, in a way that it could not matter to anything whose capacity for wanting to be understood had been fully stripped away. The Necrons have been trying to reclaim the galaxy for the 60 million years since they gave up the qualities that would have made reclaiming it feel like something. The Dreadnought has been trying to survive for 4,000 years in a machine that was never supposed to be a home, carrying the full weight of that difficulty in a consciousness that cannot put it down, cannot turn it off, cannot be programmed to not feel it. Which would you rather be? It is not a question with a clean answer. It may not have an answer at all, but it is a question that the galaxy, in the 41st millennium, is asking constantly, in 100 different forms, across every confrontation between the ancient and emptied, and the young and full, between the machine and the mortal, between the undying and the beautifully, terrifyingly alive. The Overlord will go on to the business of dynasty building and reconquest, and will be very good at it, because the Necrons are very good at things they were programmed to be good at. The Cryptek will continue its analysis and will produce, eventually, a paper in whatever passes for academic tradition among Necron technologists, a paper that will provoke considerable controversy and perhaps considerable thought. The Dreadnought occupant will, after what time passes, find its way back to something to the surface, perhaps, and eventually to something like contact with the Imperium, with all the complications that this entails, given where it has been and what it has learned. But none of those futures are here yet. What is here is this: two ancient things, in a room lit by the cold light of 60 million years, talking across a gulf of difference so vast that the translation system can only ever approximate it, and finding in the approximation something that neither of them had expected to find, something that resembles recognition, something that resembles the beginning of being known. Section 14. What this means for the galaxy. And for us. We started in silence. The silence of a tomb that had been sealed for 60 million years. The silence of an unexpected presence in that tomb. The silence that precedes a discovery that neither party involved could have planned for or predicted. We end somewhere else. Not with resolution. The galaxy does not resolve. Not in the 41st millennium. Not in any millennium. It simply continues its enormous and violent and astonishing process of existence. But with a set of things that the encounter has illuminated, things that the specific nature of this story, Necron and Dreadnought, undying conqueror and preserved warrior, two forms of machine-maintained consciousness, speaking across the incomprehensible gulf between them, makes visible in a way that nothing else quite does. The first thing it illuminates is what preservation costs. The Necrons chose immortality and paid for it with their souls. The Dreadnought tradition chooses preservation and pays for it with freedom, with the ability to simply be in the world, unencumbered by metal and machinery, feeling the texture of ordinary existence. Every form of preservation in the 41st millennium has a price tag. The Chaos Space Marines, who sold themselves to the Dark Gods in exchange for power, pay with their sanity and their integrity. The Eldar who survived the fall pay with the trauma of that fall, carried through centuries of life that cannot forget it. The forces of the Imperium maintain their civilization across 10,000 worlds by the expenditure of human lives on such a scale that individual deaths have stopped meaning almost anything to the system as a whole. No one in this universe gets to simply be, to simply exist without cost. The question is always only what you are paying with and whether what you receive in exchange is worth it. The second thing this encounter illuminates is the value of witness. The Dreadnought occupant has been present asleep, yes, but present through more history than most beings living in the 41st millennium can access through any archive. It was there when the heresy tore the Imperium apart. It was there when the rebuilding began. It passed through, in brief waking intervals, centuries of imperial history that are now the stuff of legend or heresy or both. It carries this not as data, but as experience, which is a fundamentally different thing and, in certain contexts, a more valuable one. The Necrons carry history of their own, of course. Their memories of the war in heaven are fragmentary and corrupted by the biotransference and the Great Sleep, but what remains is 60 million years of experience, the oldest living record of events that shape the galaxy's fundamental structure. An overlord that awakens is, in a very real sense, walking history. But the difference between the Dreadnought's history and the overlord's is the difference between remembering something and having lived through it in a way that left marks. The overlord's memories are data. The Dreadnought occupant's memories are experience, felt and fought through and survived, carrying all the textures that only direct participation provides. Witness matters. It matters that someone was there and remembers not only the facts, but the feeling. The third thing this story illuminates is the nature of curiosity as a form of survival. The overlord's curiosity about the Dreadnought occupant is not strategically required. The intelligence value of the exchange, while real, does not fully justify the time and attention that the overlord devotes to it. What justifies it is something older and less strategic: the genuine desire to understand something that does not fit existing categories, to push against the boundaries of the known rather than simply administering what is already understood. This curiosity is one of the things that survived biotransference in the overlord's case, one of the qualities that the finest necrodermis bodies managed to preserve when so much else was lost. And the Dreadnought occupant's decision to engage, to speak rather than to remain silent, to risk communication rather than simply waiting to be destroyed or released, is also a form of curiosity. The curiosity of a being that has been in the dark for a very long time and finds, upon waking into an entirely unexpected context, that it is still interested in what the context might contain. Both of them could have defaulted to the simpler options. The overlord could have destroyed the machine and returned to the business of awakening the dynasty. The occupant could have refused to speak and waited passively for whatever came next. Neither of them did. They talked instead, because something in both of them, something that the loss of soul did not quite extinguish in the overlord, and that the machine's constraints could not quite suppress in the occupant, still wanted to know. Curiosity is perhaps the thing that makes it hardest for the universe to fully kill you. You keep wanting to see what happens next. The fourth and final thing this encounter illuminates is the smallest and the largest. In the 41st millennium, a setting defined by its own grimness and darkness and the grinding, endless violence of a galaxy at perpetual war, there are still moments of contact. Still moments when two things that should only be enemies find themselves in a context where the options are more complicated than attack and defend. Still moments when something unexpected, a sealed door, a surviving life sign, a machine standing in the dark of an ancient tomb, with someone inside it, who is still alive and still trying, creates the conditions for something that is not friendship, cannot be friendship, is too weighted with history and difference and fundamental incompatibility to be friendship, but is real nonetheless. The Necrons are not villains in the straightforward sense. This is one of the things that Warhammer 40,000's lore handles with more sophistication than it is sometimes given credit for. The Necrons were a people who were tricked into a terrible bargain, who spent 60 million years paying the price of that bargain in a sleep that took from them everything the bargain had claimed to preserve, and who woke into a galaxy that had moved on without them and has no particular inclination to accommodate their ancient claims. Their desire to reclaim what is theirs is, in abstract, comprehensible. It is the application of that desire, the methods, the scale, the willingness to exterminate species and devastate worlds in pursuit of reconquest that makes them the enemy of virtually everything else currently living. The Imperium of man is not heroic in the straightforward sense either. The Imperium is a civilization that has survived 10,000 years of existential threat by making compromises of such terrible depth that the civilization you end up with is barely recognizable as what the Emperor intended. The theocracy, the Inquisition, the endless sacrifice of human lives, in quantities so vast that individual deaths are statistically invisible, these are not heroic. They are the residue of survival under conditions that no civilization should face, the institutional trauma of 10,000 years of nearly losing everything. Both of these civilizations, in their different ways, have paid their survival in the currency of what they once were. Both have purchased continuity at the cost of something that can never be fully recovered. The Dreadnought in the Hidden Chamber is, in its way, a small-scale model of this. One being, one machine, one consciousness that has been preserved at enormous cost to everything around it that made preservation feel like it was worth the cost. A warrior who has outlasted the battles, outlasted the brothers, outlasted perhaps the very chapter that built the machine it sits inside. A consciousness carrying forward through time in a form that was designed for war, but has instead been waiting, in a dead corner of an alien tomb, for a rescue that never arrived, and yet not bitter. Or not only bitter, something in the conversations the occupant has had with the Overlord suggests a consciousness that has, over the long centuries, developed a kind of clarity about existence that only comes from having been stripped of everything non-essential. When you can no longer eat, or drink, or touch, or be touched, when the machine is your entire interface with the physical world, when the only sensory experience available is what the machine's sensors provide, and the only social experience is the intermittent contact of brief awakenings that keep getting shorter, you either break or you find what remains when everything else is gone. You find what you actually are, underneath all the things you thought were you. The occupant is not what it was in the Horus Heresy era. That being is gone or transformed beyond simple continuity. What remains is something that has been refined by loss, in the way that ore is refined by heat. The impurity's gone, the essential thing concentrated. Connection is perhaps the wrong word too. It implies more resolution than the situation actually contains. What it is, perhaps, is recognition. The recognition of something real in another being, even a being entirely unlike yourself. The recognition that what you carry, and what they carry, has weight in common, even when the burdens themselves are different. The Necrons lost their souls, and have been grieving that loss for 60 million years, without quite having the emotional capacity to grieve it. The Dreadnought tradition preserves the soul, and extracts an enormous price for doing so. Neither knows with certainty whether its way is better, because neither has experienced the other. But they have spent some hours talking about it, in a chamber deep underground, on a world that is slowly coming alive after 60 million years of silence, in the light that never flickers and never changes, and will go on long after both of them are gone. That is something. There is one more thing worth saying, before we leave the chamber and the silence and the cold viridian light. The universe in which this story takes place is not kind. It does not offer comfort or resolution or neat moral conclusions. It is a universe of massive scale and indifferent violence, where civilizations that built themselves across thousands of years can fall in a night, and where gods, real and terrible gods, play games with the lives of mortal beings for reasons that the mortal beings can barely perceive, let alone understand. In this universe, the question of what makes existence meaningful is not academic. It is the question that every sentient being in it faces, in every moment, whether they have the luxury of articulating it or not. The Necrons tried to answer it by removing mortality. They found that mortality was not the problem. The problem was that without it, meaning drained away too. The Dreadnought occupant tried or had the answer chosen for it, which amounts to much the same thing to preserve life at any cost, and found that the life preserved at any cost is a life that must spend a great deal of energy asking whether the preservation was worth the cost. Neither answer is right, neither is wrong in a simple way. They are the answers that the beings in question were capable of giving, under the constraints they faced, with the knowledge they had. They are human answers or Necron tier answers, or Astartes answers, which is to say, they are the best that finite beings can do when faced with infinite questions. In a setting that frequently asks us to look at darkness and take it seriously, that is, perhaps, something worth holding on to. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you made it this far, please leave a comment below, drop your thoughts on this scenario, tell us what you think would happen next between the Overlord and the Dreadnought occupant, or just tell us where you are in the world watching from and what time it is there. Every single comment means the world and genuinely helps this channel grow. If you learned something today or found something here worth thinking about, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories like this one, waiting, stories that go deep into the lore and ask the questions that the lore opens up, but does not always close. Hit the bell if you want to be notified when the next one arrives. The Necrons are waking up across the galaxy. The Dreadnoughts are waiting in the deep halls of 1,000-chapter fortresses, sleeping between their battles. The stories those facts contain are endless. We will tell as many of them as we can. There is something particular about this kind of story, the story of two very different things, finding themselves in the same impossible situation and discovering that the situation has something to say about both of them. The galaxy in the 41st millennium does not often offer that kind of moment. It offers war, mostly. It offers sacrifice and tragedy and the grinding weight of history on everyone who tries to live within it. It offers the specific darkness of a setting that takes seriously the idea that the universe is vast and cold, and largely indifferent to the creatures that move through it. And yet within that darkness, again and again, the lore finds moments of genuine and unexpected depth. But it also, sometimes, offers chambers, sealed chambers, deep underground, lit by ancient light, machines that carried something precious through time. Old things finding each other in the dark. Those moments are worth spending time in. Those are the moments where the lore becomes something more than strategy and stat block and battle outcome. They become the thing that lore is actually for a mirror that shows us something about what we are, reflected in the strange distances of 60 million years and alien nature, and the specific human question of what it costs to preserve a consciousness across time. We are all, in some sense, trying to figure out what is worth keeping. We are all, in some sense, carrying forward things we hope will matter to someone who comes after us. We are all, in some sense, sleeping and waking and sleeping again, and wondering, in the waking, what has changed. The Overlord returns to its dynasty. The Dreadnought waits in the chamber. The galaxy continues its ancient and violent and astonishing turning. The vigil of the Necrons has no certain end. The vigil of the Dreadnought never did either. Until next time, rest well. The vigil continues,